October 3rd, 2025, Kodiak bear attacks hunters, $80,000 SUV destroyed. The first mistake George Wallace made was parking the brand new 2025 Ford Expedition Max Platinum, exactly where the game trail intersected with the old logging road. The second mistake was leaving the cooler full of salmon they'd caught the previous day in the back seat overnight. The third and final mistake was assuming that 40 years of hunting experience in the lower 48 had prepared him for what stalked the remote wilderness of Kodiak Island, Alaska. George Raymond Wallace, 52 years old, stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and carried the kind of confident bearing that came from 3 decades as a successful construction contractor in Boise, Idaho. His weathered hands, scarred from countless encounters with power tools and rough lumber, gripped the steering wheel of the pristine black SUV as he navigated the rutted dirt road that wound through the dense Sitka spruce forest. The vehicle, purchased just 6 weeks earlier for exactly $79,847 after taxes and fees, still carried that new car smell that mixed with the scent of gun oil and the faint aroma of the premium leather seats. Beside him, Anthony Miguel Perez shifted restlessly in the passenger seat, his dark eyes scanning the tree line through the tinted windows. At 47, Anthony possessed the lean, wiry build of a man who had spent his adult life as a wilderness guide and outfitter based out of Anchorage. His angular face, marked by a thin scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline, a memento from a climbing accident in Denali National Park 12 years earlier, bore the permanent tan of someone who lived outdoors. Unlike George's confident enthusiasm, Anthony carried himself with the careful alertness of a man who understood that the Alaskan wilderness demanded respect above all else. The two men had met 18 months earlier at a hunting expo in Salt Lake City, where Anthony had been working a booth for Kodiak Adventures, the guiding service he co-owned with his business partner, Marcus Chen. George had approached the booth with the eager enthusiasm of a successful businessman looking for his next great adventure, his wallet thick with the profits from Wallace Construction's most successful year to date. What started as a client relationship had evolved into an unlikely friendship built on shared stories around campfires and a mutual appreciation for the solitude that could only be found in untamed places. This October hunting trip represented the culmination of months of planning and preparation. George had paid Anthony's guiding service $12,000 for a 10-day brown bear hunting expedition on Kodiak Island, complete with transportation, lodging, and all necessary permits. The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Establish a base camp in the remote southeastern section of the island, scout for sign of the massive Kodiak brown bears that called this wilderness home, and hopefully harvest a trophy animal that would provide George with the hunting story of a lifetime. Kodiak Island, stretching 100 miles from north to south and 60 miles from east to west, contained some of the most pristine and dangerous wilderness left in North America. Home to an estimated 3,500 Kodiak brown bears, the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world, the island's 2 million acres of mountains, forests, rivers and coastal plains provided habitat for animals that regularly exceeded 1,000 pounds and could reach heights of 10 feet when standing on their hind legs. These were not the black bears that George had encountered during decades of hunting in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. These were apex predators that had evolved in isolation for 12,000 years, developing into living manifestations of raw, unbridled power. The morning of October 1st had dawned clear and cold, with temperatures hovering just above freezing and a crisp north wind that carried the scent of early snow from the peaks of the Kodiak mountain range. Anthony had picked George up at the Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport in his well-worn Chevrolet Suburban, and they had driven to the small coastal town of Kodiak, where they caught the afternoon float plane that would transport them to their hunting area. The flight, aboard a de Havilland Beaver operated by Kodiak Air Service, had taken 43 minutes through increasingly remote terrain. As they flew south and east from the town of Kodiak, the landscape below gradually transformed from areas marked by human habitation to pristine wilderness that appeared untouched by civilization. Pilot Brian Mitchell, a grizzled veteran with over 20,000 hours of flight time in Alaska, had pointed out landmarks through the scratched plexiglass windows: the serpentine course of the Karluk River, the jagged peaks of the Kodiak Mountains rising to heights exceeding 4,000 feet, and the countless small lakes and streams that provided life-giving water to the island's ecosystem. "See that drainage down there?" Brian had shouted over the constant roar of the aircraft's Pratt & Whitney R985 radial engine, pointing toward a broad valley that stretched from the mountains to the coast. "That's where you're headed. Karluk Lake drains into Karluk Lagoon, and that whole watershed is prime bear country. Fish run up those streams from July through October, and where there's fish, there's bears. Big ones." The pilot had set the aircraft down on Karluk Lake with the practiced ease of someone who had performed similar landings thousands of times. The lake, stretching nearly 10 miles from north to south, provided a natural highway into the heart of some of the most remote bear habitat on the island. As they unloaded their gear onto the rocky shore, George had felt the first real stirring of apprehension about what lay ahead. The silence, broken only by the gentle lapping of wavelets against the rocks and the distant cry of a raven, seemed to press in around them with an almost physical weight. Anthony had arranged for a local contact, a part-time hunting guide named Robert Bear Thompson, to meet them at the lake with an all-terrain vehicle that would transport them and their equipment to their intended camping area. Bear Thompson, 61 years old and a lifelong resident of Kodiak Island, possessed the kind of intimate knowledge of the terrain that could only come from decades of hunting, fishing, and guiding in the area. His weathered face, marked by deep lines carved by wind and sun, held pale blue eyes that seemed to catalogue and assess every detail of their surroundings. "You boys picked a good time," Bear had told them as they loaded their gear into his modified Polaris Ranger. "Fish have been running strong all month, which means the bears are active and feeding heavy before they den up for winter. Saw fresh sign yesterday not 3 miles from where we're headed." He paused to spit a stream of tobacco juice into the gravel. "Course, that also means you need to be extra careful. A bear putting on winter fat ain't something you want to surprise." The ride to their camping area had taken just over an hour, following a network of old logging roads and game trails that wound through dense forest and across several small streams. The terrain varied from thick stands of Sitka spruce and western hemlock to open meadows carpeted with blueberry bushes and devil's club. As they traveled, Bear had provided a running commentary on the local wildlife, pointing out fresh bear sign, describing the habits and territories of individual animals he knew from years of observation, and sharing stories of encounters that ranged from humorous to terrifying. "That big fellow there," he had said, pointing to a massive pile of scat beside the trail, "that's from Scarface. Been seeing sign from him for going on 8 years now. Got that name from a set of claw marks across his muzzle. Probably from a fight with another boar during mating season. He's pushing 1,400 pounds, and he owns about 20 square miles of territory in this drainage. Smart as a whip and twice as mean when he wants to be." George had felt his pulse quicken at the description. A bear of that size would provide exactly the kind of trophy he had traveled 3,000 miles to pursue. In his mind, he could already see the massive hide stretched across the wall of his den back home, could imagine the stories he would tell at hunting camps for years to come. They had established their base camp in a small clearing beside Karluk Creek, approximately 8 miles southwest of the lake where the plane had dropped them off. The location, chosen by Anthony for its strategic advantages, provided access to fresh water, offered good visibility in multiple directions, and sat on elevated ground that would provide natural drainage in case of rain. The camp consisted of 2 high-quality four-season tents, a larger model that would serve as their main shelter, and a smaller one for equipment storage, along with a portable camp kitchen, bear-proof food storage containers, and all the other equipment necessary for an extended stay in remote wilderness. The first 2 days had passed uneventfully, with George and Anthony using the time to scout the surrounding area, identify game trails and feeding areas, and accustom themselves to the rhythms of the wilderness. They had seen abundant sign of bear activity, tracks in the soft earth along stream banks, claw marks on trees, well-worn trails through the forest, and the remnants of salmon that had been caught and partially consumed. The forest seemed to pulse with life, from the squirrels that chattered in the treetops to the ravens that followed their movements with intelligent, calculating eyes. On the morning of October 3rd, George woke before dawn to the sound of light rain pattering against the nylon walls of his tent. The weather had turned during the night, with a low-pressure system moving in from the Gulf of Alaska, bringing with it the promise of several days of wet, overcast conditions. Through the translucent fabric, he could see the grey outline of Anthony moving around the camp kitchen, already beginning preparations for breakfast. "Coffee's almost ready," Anthony called softly as George emerged from his tent, pulling on his rain jacket against the steady drizzle. "Weather report on the satellite phone says this system's going to hang around for the next 3 days. Might make hunting more challenging, but it could also work in our favor. Bears tend to be more active in wet weather, especially when they're feeding on salmon." George nodded, accepting the steaming mug of coffee that Anthony handed him. The hot liquid tasted like salvation in the cool morning air, and he savored the warmth as it spread through his chest. Around them, the forest was waking up slowly, the sound of dripping water from wet branches mixing with the distant murmur of the creek and the occasional call of a bird somewhere in the canopy above. "What's the plan for today?" George asked, checking his watch. It was 6:47 a.m., and full daylight was still more than an hour away. Anthony spread a topographic map across the camp table, protecting it from the drizzle with a piece of clear plastic. "I want to check out this area here," he said, pointing to a section of the map marked with several small lakes and connecting streams. "Bear Thompson mentioned seeing fresh sign there 2 days ago, and the salmon run has been particularly strong in those smaller tributaries. It's about a 4-mile hike from here, which means we'll want to get an early start." The hike began at 7:30 a.m., after they had consumed a breakfast of oatmeal, coffee, and strips of bacon cooked over their portable camp stove. Both men carried day packs loaded with water, emergency food, first aid supplies, navigation equipment, and all the other gear necessary for a day in the wilderness. George carried his primary hunting rifle, a custom .375H and H Magnum built by a gunsmith in Montana specifically for dangerous game hunting. The rifle, which had cost him nearly $8,000, featured a premium barrel, custom stock, and high-quality optics that would allow for accurate shooting at distances up to 300 yards. Anthony carried a backup rifle, a well-worn .300 Winchester Magnum that had accompanied him on dozens of hunting expeditions over the past 15 years. More importantly, he carried a .44 Magnum revolver on his hip and a canister of bear spray clipped to his chest harness. In his experience, the spray often proved more effective than firearms in deterring aggressive bears, particularly in close-quarters encounters where precise shot placement became difficult or impossible. The game trail they followed wound through dense forest, crossing several small streams and skirting the edges of beaver ponds that reflected the grey sky like mirrors. The recent rain had made the ground soft and muddy, and they moved quietly, placing their feet carefully to minimize noise that might alert wildlife to their presence. Anthony led the way, his experienced eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of animal activity. Approximately 2 miles into their hike, they encountered the first significant bear sign of the day. A massive Sitka spruce, easily 5 feet in diameter and towering more than 100 feet above the forest floor, bore fresh claw marks that extended from ground level to a height of nearly 10 feet. The marks, 4 parallel gouges carved deep into the bark, were so fresh that sap still seeped from the wounds. "Jesus," George whispered, running his fingers along the claw marks. The grooves were deep enough to insert his entire index finger up to the second knuckle. How big would a bear have to be to reach that high? Anthony examined the marks with the careful attention of someone who had spent years reading sign in the wilderness. Standing on his hind legs, he'd have to be close to 9 feet tall to make marks that high. That puts him in the 12 to 1,400-pound range, maybe bigger. He looked up at the gouges with something approaching reverence. This is a mature boar in his prime, and he's marking his territory. We're definitely in the right area. They continued following the trail, which gradually descended toward a series of small lakes connected by fast-flowing streams. The sound of running water grew louder as they approached, and Anthony held up his hand, signaling for silence. Through the trees ahead, they could see the dark water of the first lake, its surface dimpled by the continuing drizzle. "This is where we need to be extra careful," Anthony whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of flowing water. "Bears are going to be concentrated around these lakes, especially with the salmon running. We'll move slow and keep our eyes open." The first lake, roughly circular and perhaps 200 yards across, appeared empty when they reached its shore. The water was dark and clear, and they could see the ghostly shapes of salmon moving in the shallows. Several partially consumed fish lay on the rocky beach, evidence of recent bear activity. Anthony knelt beside one of the carcasses, examining it closely. "This fish was killed within the last few hours," he said, pointing to the bright red color of the exposed flesh. "Bear grabbed it, ate the brain and eggs and left the rest. That's typical feeding behavior when fish are abundant." He stood and scanned the surrounding forest, "which means our friend is probably still somewhere in the area." They spent the next hour carefully working their way around the perimeter of the lake, photographing tracks and sign, and glassing the surrounding terrain with binoculars. The rain continued to fall steadily, creating a persistent white noise that would mask the sound of their movement, but would also make it more difficult to hear approaching animals. George found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, feeling as though unseen eyes were watching them from the dark spaces between the trees. At the far end of the lake, where the inlet stream cascaded down a series of natural rock steps, they discovered what Anthony later described as a bear highway, a well-worn trail that showed signs of heavy use by multiple animals. The soft earth beside the stream was marked with tracks of various sizes, from the dinner plate-sized prints of mature boars to the smaller tracks of sows with cubs. "This is incredible," George said, kneeling beside a particularly clear track that showed the distinctive long claws of a brown bear's front paw. "I've never seen anything like this. How many different bears do you think use this trail?" Anthony studied the tracks with the practiced eye of someone who had been reading animal signs since childhood. "I count at least 6 different individuals based on track size and spacing. Could be more. Some of these prints overlap, and the rain is starting to wash out the details." He pointed to a track that was noticeably larger than the others. "But that big fellow there, that's our friend from the claw marks on the tree. Probably weighs 1,400 pounds if he weighs an ounce." As they followed the trail upstream, the terrain became increasingly rugged. The stream carved its way through a narrow canyon, with steep rocky walls rising 30 feet on either side. The trail followed the top of the canyon, winding through dense stands of alder and willow that formed natural tunnels over the path. Visibility was limited to just a few yards in any direction, and both men found themselves moving with increased caution. "I don't like this," Anthony said, pausing at a point where the trail made a sharp turn around a massive boulder. "Too many blind spots, too much cover for something big to hide in. If we bump into a bear in here, we're not going to have many options." George felt his heart rate increase as the implications sank in. In the dense cover of the canyon, they would have perhaps seconds to react to an encounter with a bear. The .375 rifle in his hands suddenly felt both reassuringly heavy and completely inadequate for the task ahead. They continued forward slowly, with Anthony leading and George following at a distance of about 10 yards. The rain had intensified, making the rocks slippery and creating small waterfalls that cascaded down the canyon walls. The air was thick with moisture and the rich, earthy smell of decomposing vegetation. At 11:47 a.m., as they rounded a bend in the trail that followed the rim of the canyon, Anthony stopped so suddenly that George nearly walked into him from behind. Following Anthony's gaze, George looked down into the canyon and felt his breath catch in his throat. 50 yards away, standing belly deep in the stream below, was the largest brown bear either man had ever seen. The animal's massive bulk seemed to fill the narrow canyon, and his dark brown coat, soaked with rain, appeared almost black in the subdued light. His head, easily the size of a beer keg, swung back and forth as he scanned the water for salmon. When he reared up on his hind legs to get a better view upstream, he reached a height that George estimated at nearly 10 feet. "Holy shit," George breathed, barely managing to keep his voice to a whisper. "That has got to be him. That's Scarface." Anthony nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off the massive bear. 1,400 pounds, easy. Maybe 1,500. And he hasn't seen us yet. He slowly reached for his binoculars, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that sudden movements could trigger a predatory response. "We need to back out of here slowly and give him plenty of space." But George was already thinking about the shot. The bear was slightly quartering away, presenting a perfect broadside angle for a clean shot behind the shoulder that would penetrate the heart and lungs. The distance was well within the effective range of his rifle, and the animal was focused on fishing, unaware of their presence. After months of planning and thousands of dollars in expenses, the trophy of a lifetime was standing 50 yards away. "I've got a clear shot," George whispered, slowly raising his rifle and settling the crosshairs on the massive bear's shoulder. "This is what we came here for." "No," Anthony said urgently, reaching out to grasp George's rifle barrel. "Not here, not in this canyon. If you wound him or if he charges, we've got nowhere to go. We need to find better ground." The debate that followed would be replayed in George's mind countless times in the days and weeks that followed. Anthony argued for patience and safety, for waiting for a better opportunity when they had room to maneuver and multiple escape routes. George argued for seizing the moment, for taking the shot while the opportunity presented itself. The conversation, conducted in whispers while the massive bear continued fishing below them, lasted perhaps 2 minutes, but seemed to stretch on forever. In the end, George's enthusiasm won out over Anthony's caution. "I'm taking the shot," he said, slowly disengaging the safety on his rifle. "This bear is perfect, and I might not get another chance like this." Anthony reluctantly moved aside, but his hand remained near the bear spray on his chest. "If this goes bad, you follow my lead and we get out of here fast. Understood?" George nodded, though his attention was already focused on the sight picture in his rifle scope. The massive bear had moved slightly, now standing quartering toward them, as he lifted his head to scan for threats. The crosshairs settled on the point of the shoulder, and George began the slow, steady squeeze of the trigger that had been drilled into him through decades of hunting experience. The .375H and H Magnum erupted with a thunderous roar that echoed off the canyon walls like the crack of lightning. The 300-grain bullet struck the bear exactly where George had aimed, penetrating deep into the chest cavity and causing massive internal damage. The animal's reaction was immediate and violent. He reared up on his hind legs with a roar that seemed to shake the very rocks of the canyon, then crashed down and began running directly up the canyon wall toward their position. "He's coming up!" Anthony shouted, fumbling for his bear spray as the massive animal crashed through the brush below them. "Get ready to run!" What happened next would be debated by wildlife experts, hunting guides, and bear behavior specialists for months afterward. Instead of fleeing the area after being wounded, as most bears would do, the massive boar seemed to locate their position with uncanny accuracy and began climbing the steep canyon wall with a speed and agility that defied his enormous size. Within seconds, he had covered half the distance between the stream bed and their position on the rim. George worked the bolt of his rifle frantically, ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round. But the bear was moving through heavy cover, and the angle of the canyon wall made a follow-up shot extremely difficult. By the time he had a clear sight picture again, the animal was less than 20 yards away and closing fast. Anthony discharged his bear spray when the animal reached the rim of the canyon, sending a cloud of capsaicin-laden aerosol directly into the bear's face. The spray, which should have stopped most bears in their tracks, seemed to have little effect on the massive boar. If anything, it appeared to enrage him further. The bear's charge covered the final 15 yards in less than 3 seconds. George managed to fire one more shot, but his aim was hurried, and the bullet went high, passing over the animal's back and disappearing into the forest beyond. Then 1,400 pounds of furious brown bear slammed into him with the force of a runaway truck. The impact drove George backward into a large Sitka spruce, the trunk of which was the only thing that prevented him from tumbling over the edge of the canyon. His rifle flew from his hands, clattering across the rocks and coming to rest against a fallen log 20 feet away. The bear's massive paws, each armed with claws longer than a man's fingers, raked across his chest and shoulders, shredding his rain jacket and the heavy wool sweater underneath. Anthony, standing just yards away, found himself in an impossible situation. His rifle was slung across his back, and by the time he could bring it to bear, the two combatants would be so entangled that any shot would risk hitting George. Instead, he grabbed the largest rock he could lift, a chunk of granite roughly the size of a football, and hurled it at the bear's head with all his strength. The rock struck the animal behind the left ear, causing him to release George momentarily and swing his massive head toward this new threat. Anthony used the distraction to grab his rifle, but before he could chamber a round, the bear had turned back to George and resumed his attack with renewed fury. What followed was a scene of violence that would haunt Anthony for the rest of his life. The massive bear, driven by pain and rage, systematically destroyed George Wallace with the kind of methodical efficiency that millions of years of evolution had programmed into apex predators. His claws, each 4 inches long and sharp as razors, opened devastating wounds across George's torso, arms and legs. His teeth, designed to crush the skulls of rival bears and tear apart salmon, found purchase in George's shoulder and began the grinding, tearing motion that would eventually separate the joint. George's screams echoed off the canyon walls, a sound so primal and terrifying that Anthony would later tell investigators it didn't sound human. For perhaps 30 seconds, though it seemed like hours, George fought back with desperate strength, landing several punches against the bear's massive skull and even managing to get his hands around the animal's throat. But the size differential was simply too great. The bear outweighed him by more than 1,000 pounds, and his strength was beyond anything a human could hope to match. Anthony finally got his rifle into position and fired 3 shots in rapid succession, aiming for the bear's vitals while trying to avoid hitting George. The first shot struck the animal in the hindquarters, the second missed entirely, and the third punched through the bear's ribcage behind the shoulder. The wounded animal released George and turned toward Anthony with blood streaming from multiple wounds. "Run!" Anthony shouted, though he wasn't sure if George could hear him over his own labored breathing and moans of pain. "I'll lead him away." The bear's charge toward Anthony was noticeably slower than his initial attack, the accumulated damage from multiple gunshot wounds beginning to take its toll. Anthony had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether both men lived or died. He could stand and fight, trying to kill the bear with the remaining rounds in his rifle, or he could run and hope to lead the animal away from George. He chose to run. The next 45 minutes would later be described by search and rescue personnel as one of the most harrowing wilderness pursuits ever documented in Alaska. Anthony fled through the dense forest with the wounded bear in pursuit, using every trick he had learned in 25 years of wilderness experience to try to lose the animal or gain enough distance to set up for a killing shot. The bear, despite his wounds, proved remarkably persistent. Brown bears can run at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour, even through dense forest. And this massive boar seemed driven by a fury that overrode his injuries. Anthony's only advantages were his intimate knowledge of the terrain and his understanding of bear behavior. He led the animal through a series of creek crossings, hoping the cold water would slow the bear down or cause him to lose the scent trail. He doubled back on his own trail twice, using fallen logs and rock outcroppings to mask his passage. He even tried climbing a large Sitka spruce, but the bear simply waited at the base of the tree, occasionally standing on his hind legs and swatting at the lower branches with his massive paws. The pursuit finally ended when Anthony reached a section of terrain that was too steep and rocky for the massive bear to navigate effectively. The animal, weakened by blood loss and exhaustion, eventually gave up the chase and disappeared back into the forest toward the canyon where George lay wounded. Anthony waited in his rocky refuge for nearly an hour, listening for any sound that might indicate the bear's return. When he was finally confident that the animal had departed, he began the careful journey back toward the canyon, moving slowly and pausing frequently to listen for any sign of the bear's presence. He found George approximately 20 yards from where the attack had begun, having apparently crawled that distance before losing consciousness. The scene that greeted Anthony was something out of a nightmare. George's clothing had been shredded, his left arm hung at an unnatural angle that indicated a dislocated shoulder and probable fractures, and deep claw marks across his chest and back leaked blood steadily into the wet earth, but he was alive. "George," Anthony called, dropping to his knees beside his friend. "Can you hear me?" George's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on Anthony's face. Did you get him?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "Don't worry about the bear," Anthony replied, pulling his first aid kit from his day pack. "I need to get you stabilized and call for help." The satellite phone, a Garmin InReach device that provided two-way communication capabilities even in remote wilderness areas, took several minutes to acquire a signal through the dense forest canopy. When the connection finally established, Anthony found himself speaking to a dispatcher at the Alaska State Troopers headquarters in Anchorage. "This is Anthony Perez, Alaska Hunting Guide license number AHG2847, he said, forcing his voice to remain calm and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I have a code red emergency at coordinates 57.2847 degrees north, 154.1923 degrees west. Brown bear attack with one critically injured hunter. I need immediate helicopter evacuation." The dispatcher, Jennifer Martinez, had been handling emergency calls for the state troopers for 8 years but calls involving bear attacks still made her heart race. Copy that, Mr. Perez. Can you describe the extent of the injuries? Anthony looked down at George, who had lost consciousness again while Anthony was establishing radio contact. Multiple deep lacerations to chest, back and extremities, possible dislocated shoulder and broken ribs, significant blood loss. Patient is unconscious but breathing. What's the weather situation at your location? Anthony looked up at the grey sky where the rain continued to fall steadily. Light rain, overcast, winds maybe 10 to 15 knots from the northwest. Visibility is good enough for helicopter operations. Understood. I'm dispatching Alaska State Troopers helicopter Alpha 77 from Kodiak. Estimated time of arrival is 45 minutes. Can you provide a safe landing zone? Anthony considered the terrain around their location. The canyon where the attack had occurred was too narrow for helicopter operations, but he remembered seeing a small meadow approximately half a mile to the north that might be suitable. There's a clearing about half a mile north of our current position. I'll need to move the patient. Negative, Jennifer replied firmly. Do not attempt to move a patient with potential spinal injuries unless absolutely necessary. Can you mark your exact location for the helicopter crew? Anthony looked around the forest, realizing that the dense canopy would make spotting them from the air extremely difficult. I have a signal mirror and emergency flares, and I can build a smoke fire if needed. Good. Now listen carefully. I'm going to walk you through some emergency medical procedures that might help stabilize your patient until the helicopter arrives. What followed was a 15-minute crash course in wilderness emergency medicine delivered by radio while Anthony tried to keep George alive in the pouring rain. Under Jennifer's guidance, he used supplies from his first aid kit to create pressure bandages for the worst of the claw wounds, improvised a sling for George's damaged arm, and checked repeatedly for signs of shock or internal bleeding. The most challenging aspect of providing aid was the remote location and weather conditions. The rain made it difficult to keep bandages dry and secure, and the dense forest canopy blocked much of the available light, making it hard to assess the true extent of George's injuries. Anthony found himself working largely by feel, using his hands to locate wounds and gauge the severity of bleeding. His pulse is getting weaker, Anthony reported during one of his regular check-ins with the dispatcher, and his skin feels cold and clammy. Those are signs of shock from blood loss, Jennifer replied. You need to keep him warm and elevate his legs if possible. Do you have a sleeping bag or emergency blanket? Anthony pulled an emergency bivy sack from his pack, a lightweight silver survival shelter designed for exactly this type of situation. As he worked to wrap George in the reflective material, his friend's eyes opened again. Anthony? George's voice was barely a whisper. I can't feel my left arm. Don't try to move, Anthony replied, though he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Loss of sensation in an extremity could indicate nerve damage or compromised blood circulation. The helicopter is on its way. You're going to be fine. George managed a weak smile. That was, one hell of a bear. Despite the gravity of the situation, Anthony found himself laughing. Even critically injured and potentially dying, George Wallace was still thinking about the hunt. Yeah, it was. Biggest damn bear I've ever seen. Did I get him? Is he dead? Anthony hesitated before answering. In the chaos of the attack and subsequent pursuit, he had been focused entirely on survival and escape. He had no idea whether his shots had been fatal or if the massive bear was still alive somewhere in the surrounding forest. I don't know, George. We'll worry about that later. The sound of helicopter rotors finally became audible at 1:23 p.m., exactly 47 minutes after Anthony's initial call for help. The aircraft, a Bell 407 operated by the Alaska State Troopers and equipped for medical evacuations, appeared through the overcast sky like salvation itself. The pilot, Captain Mark Rodriguez had been flying rescue operations in Alaska for 12 years and had participated in dozens of bear attack evacuations. His crew included paramedic Sarah Chen and flight medic David Park, both of whom had extensive experience in wilderness medicine. Finding Anthony and George in the dense forest required several minutes of careful searching, with Anthony using his signal mirror to reflect what little sunlight penetrated the clouds. When the helicopter crew finally spotted them, Captain Rodriguez faced the challenging task of finding a way to extract the patient from terrain that offered no suitable landing zones. "I can't set down anywhere near your location," Rodriguez reported over the radio. "But I can hover and deploy my crew on a rope. How far can you carry the patient?" Anthony looked at George, who had been drifting in and out of consciousness for the past hour. Moving him any significant distance would require improvising a stretcher and could potentially worsen his injuries. "He's got possible spinal damage. I don't think we should move him." "Copy that. We're coming down to you." What followed was a textbook example of wilderness rescue operations. Paramedic Chen and flight medic Park rappelled down through the forest canopy on a 150-foot rope, carrying with them a complete set of medical equipment and a specialized stretcher designed for helicopter evacuations. Their arrival brought a level of medical expertise that transformed George's chances of survival from uncertain to good. "Let's see what we're dealing with," Chen said, immediately beginning a systematic assessment of George's injuries. Her examination revealed the full extent of the damage: 4 deep claw wounds across his chest that required immediate suturing, a dislocated left shoulder with probable fractures, multiple lacerations on his arms and legs, and significant blood loss that had him teetering on the edge of shock. "We need to get him loaded and get moving," she told Park as they worked to stabilize George for transport. "He's lost a lot of blood, and some of these wounds are deeper than they look." The extraction process required carefully hoisting George up through the forest canopy while both medics attended to him, a delicate operation made more challenging by the continuing rain and the unstable air currents created by the helicopter's rotor wash. Anthony followed on a separate line, carrying both his and George's rifles along with their essential gear. The flight to the Kodiak hospital took 18 minutes, during which the medical crew worked continuously to keep George stable. They established intravenous lines, administered pain medication and antibiotics, and provided supplemental oxygen while monitoring his vital signs for any indication of deteriorating condition. Dr. Amanda Foster, the emergency room physician who received George upon his arrival at the hospital, had treated bear attack victims before, but she was still shocked by the severity of his injuries. "This patient needs surgery immediately," she told the trauma team that assembled to receive him. "Alert the OR and get me a complete blood panel. And somebody call in Dr. Williams. We're going to need an orthopedic specialist for that shoulder." The next 8 hours were a blur of emergency surgery, blood transfusions, and careful monitoring as a team of medical professionals worked to save George's life and repair the extensive damage inflicted by 1,400 pounds of furious brown bear. Dr. Foster led the team that cleaned and sutured the claw wounds, some of which penetrated nearly to the rib cage and required internal exploration to check for organ damage. Dr. Robert Williams, the orthopedic surgeon, spent 3 hours reconstructing George's shoulder joint, which had been completely dislocated, and showed fractures to both the humeral head and the scapula. The surgery required the installation of titanium plates and screws to hold the damaged bones in proper alignment while they healed. "He's incredibly lucky," Dr. Foster told Anthony as he waited in the hospital's family room. "Another few hours without medical attention and he probably would have died from blood loss. And if that bear had gotten a good bite on his head or neck." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Anthony nodded, though he felt anything but lucky. The events of the day kept replaying in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he should have done something differently. Should have insisted they leave when they first spotted the bear. Should have taken the shot himself when George hesitated. Should have been faster in getting his rifle into action when the bear charged. "What happens now?" he asked. "He'll need at least a week in the hospital, probably longer depending on how the healing progresses. The shoulder is going to require extensive physical therapy, and there's a chance he'll never regain full range of motion in that arm. As for the claw wounds, they should heal without permanent damage as long as we can prevent infection." The next morning brought a parade of visitors to George's hospital room. Alaska State Troopers arrived to take statements about the attack, hoping to gather information that might help them locate and assess the bear that had caused the injuries. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game sent a wildlife biologist to discuss the circumstances of the encounter and determine whether the bear posed an ongoing threat to other hunters or hikers in the area. Trooper Lieutenant James Morrison, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement in Alaska, conducted the formal interview with Anthony in a conference room at the hospital. The questions were detailed and methodical, designed to create a complete picture of events leading up to and during the attack. "Walk me through the timeline again," Morrison said, consulting his notes. "You first spotted the bear at what time?" 11:47 a.m., Anthony replied. "I remember checking my watch because George asked about it later. And the first shot was fired when, maybe 10 minutes later. We spent some time watching the bear and discussing whether to take the shot." Morrison made notes in his report. "Tell me about the bear's behavior after it was wounded. Did it immediately charge, or was there a delay?" Anthony closed his eyes, trying to recall the exact sequence of events. "It was immediate. As soon as the bullet hit, he reared up and roared, then came straight up the canyon wall toward us. No hesitation, no attempt to flee. It was like he knew exactly where the shot came from." "That's unusual behavior for a wounded bear," Morrison commented. "Most of them will try to escape rather than engage. This suggests either an extremely aggressive individual or one that was already stressed or agitated before the encounter." The interview continued for 2 hours, with Morrison asking detailed questions about everything from the weather conditions to the specific ammunition George had been using. The information would be compiled into an official report that would be shared with wildlife management agencies and used to update safety recommendations for hunters in the area. Dr. Sarah Thompson from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game arrived that afternoon to discuss the biological aspects of the encounter. A specialist in brown bear behavior with a PhD from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, she was particularly interested in understanding why this particular bear had reacted so aggressively to being wounded. "Based on your description of the animal's size and the territory where you encountered him, I believe this was likely a mature, dominant male that was protecting a prime feeding area," she explained to Anthony. "During the pre-denning period in October, bears can become extremely territorial about high-quality food sources. If this bear viewed your presence as a threat to his access to salmon, that could explain the aggressive response. But wouldn't a wounded bear normally try to escape rather than attack?" Anthony asked. Dr. Thompson nodded. "In most cases, yes. But there are documented instances of brown bears, particularly large males, responding to gunshot wounds with increased aggression rather than flight. We call it a defensive charge. The bear perceives the hunter as a threat that must be eliminated rather than simply avoided." She went on to explain that Kodiak bears, due to their size and isolation, had evolved different behavioral patterns than brown bears in other parts of Alaska. These animals have been the apex predators on this island for thousands of years. They haven't learned to fear humans the way bears in more populated areas have. When challenged, their instinct is often to fight rather than flee. The question of whether the bear had survived the encounter became a matter of significant concern for wildlife officials. Anthony's shots had wounded the animal, but he had no way of knowing whether the injuries were fatal. A wounded bear posed a potential threat to other hunters, hikers, or residents of the area, and protocols called for an immediate search to locate and assess the animal's condition. A tracking team, led by Alaska Department of Fish and Game Enforcement Officer Tom Bradley, was dispatched to the attack site on the morning of October 4th. The team included 2 experienced tracking dogs, a wildlife veterinarian, and several armed personnel, trained in dealing with dangerous wildlife situations. The weather had cleared overnight, and the team was able to reach the canyon where the attack occurred using the same helicopter that had evacuated George. The scene they discovered told a dramatic story of violence and survival that matched Anthony's account in every detail. "There's blood everywhere," Bradley reported over radio to his supervisor, "both human and bear blood, spread over probably a 50-yard area. The ground is torn up like a battlefield." The tracking dogs immediately picked up the bear's scent trail leading away from the attack site. The trail, marked by drops of blood and disturbed vegetation, led deeper into the wilderness toward a series of remote valleys that provided some of the most pristine bear habitat on the island. The search team followed the trail for nearly 3 miles before the dogs lost the scent at a large creek crossing. Despite extensive searching of the surrounding area, they found no sign of the bear, alive or dead. "It's possible the animal crossed the creek and continued into the backcountry," Bradley explained in his report. "Given the amount of blood loss we documented along the trail, the bear was seriously wounded, but whether those wounds were fatal, we can't determine without locating the carcass." The inability to confirm the bear's fate led to an immediate closure of the hunting area where the attack had occurred. Fish and game officials posted warning signs at all access points and issued advisories to outfitters and guides operating in the region. The closure would remain in effect until either the bear's carcass was located or enough time had passed to reasonably assume the animal had died from its wounds. Meanwhile, word of the attack spread quickly through Alaska's tight-knit hunting and guiding community. Bear attacks, while not uncommon in Alaska, always generated intense interest and concern among those who made their living in the wilderness. The details of this particular incident, the size of the bear, the severity of the attack, and the dramatic escape and rescue made it the subject of conversation in hunting lodges, guide services, and sporting goods stores throughout the state. Anthony found himself fielding phone calls from friends, colleagues, and complete strangers who had heard about the attack and wanted to know the details. Some called to offer support and assistance. Others were merely curious about what it was like to survive such an encounter. The attention made him uncomfortable, but he understood that people needed to hear these stories as part of their own preparation for wilderness experiences. "The thing people don't understand," he told a reporter from the Anchorage Daily News who interviewed him by phone, "is how fast everything happened. From the time the bear started charging to when it was all over was maybe 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. Time gets distorted when you're in a survival situation like that." The interview appeared in the newspaper 3 days later under the headline "Kodiak Bear Attack Leaves Hunter Fighting for Life." The article included a detailed account of the encounter, quotes from wildlife experts about bear behavior, and a sidebar about safety precautions for hunters in bear country. It was picked up by national news services and appeared in newspapers across the country, making George and Anthony's story part of the broader conversation about wilderness safety and human-wildlife conflicts. George himself remained largely unaware of the media attention during his first week in the hospital. The combination of pain medication, antibiotics, and the trauma of his injuries kept him in a state somewhere between sleep and wakefulness most of the time. When he was alert, his primary concerns were managing his pain and understanding the extent of his injuries. "How bad is it, really?" he asked Dr. Foster during one of her daily visits. "Don't sugarcoat it. I want to know what I'm looking at." Dr. Foster pulled up a chair beside his bed and spread out his X-rays on the bedside table. "The good news is that you're going to live, and you're going to recover most of your normal function. The bad news is that it's going to take time and you're going to have some permanent limitations." She pointed to the X-rays of his shoulder. "The orthopedic damage is the most serious issue. Dr. Williams did an excellent job reconstructing the joint, but you've lost some range of motion that you'll never get back. You'll probably always have some stiffness and discomfort, especially in cold weather." "What about the claw wounds?" "Those are healing well. They look worse than they are. Most of the damage was to soft tissue and muscle. You'll have some impressive scars, but no permanent disability from those injuries." George nodded, absorbing the information. "Could have been a lot worse." "Could have been fatal," Dr. Foster agreed. "If Anthony hadn't been there to provide immediate first aid and call for help, we wouldn't be having this conversation." The psychological impact of the attack began to manifest as George's physical condition improved. Nightmares were common, vivid dreams in which he relived the encounter over and over again, each time with slight variations that somehow made them more terrifying than the actual event. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, convinced that he could hear the sound of the bear's claws scraping against the hospital room floor. Dr. Patricia Yamamoto, a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma counseling, was brought in to help George process the emotional aftermath of his experience. "What you're experiencing is completely normal," she told him during their first session. "Surviving a life-threatening encounter like this creates a form of post-traumatic stress that can take months or even years to fully resolve." "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently," George admitted. "If I had listened to Anthony and not taken that shot, none of this would have happened." "Survivor's guilt is also a normal response," Dr. Yamamoto explained. "But you need to understand that you made the best decision you could with the information you had at the time. Second-guessing yourself isn't helpful and isn't fair to yourself." The counseling sessions became a regular part of George's recovery process, helping him develop coping strategies for the anxiety and flashbacks that continued to plague him even after his physical wounds had healed. The work was difficult and often emotionally exhausting, but it was necessary for him to regain some semblance of his normal life. Anthony, meanwhile, was dealing with his own psychological aftermath from the encounter. As a professional hunting guide, he felt a profound sense of responsibility for what had happened to George. He replayed the events in his mind constantly, wondering if his experience and training should have led him to make different decisions that might have prevented the attack. "I should have insisted we leave as soon as we saw the bear," he told his business partner, Marcus Chen, during a meeting at their Anchorage office. "I knew the situation was dangerous, but I let George talk me into staying." Marcus, who had been guiding hunters in Alaska for 15 years, understood the complex emotions his partner was experiencing. "You can't control every variable in the wilderness," he said. "Bears are unpredictable, and even experienced hunters make judgment calls that seem right at the time. What matters is that you got George out alive." The attack had immediate implications for their guiding business. 2 upcoming hunts were cancelled by clients who had heard about the incident and decided they weren't comfortable with the level of risk involved. Their insurance company launched an investigation to determine whether proper safety protocols had been followed, and Anthony found himself questioning whether he wanted to continue leading hunters into dangerous situations where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. The investigation by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game eventually concluded that neither George nor Anthony had violated any hunting regulations or safety protocols. The attack was classified as a defensive encounter in which a bear had responded aggressively to perceived threats to its territory and food sources. No criminal charges were filed and no citations were issued. However, the incident led to several changes in how hunting guides operated in the area. New requirements were implemented for guides operating in known bear habitats, including mandatory bear spray training, enhanced first aid certification, and improved communication equipment. The attack also became a case study used in hunter education courses throughout Alaska, illustrating the importance of proper planning and decision-making in dangerous situations. George was released from the hospital on October 15th, 12 days after the attack. His left arm remained in a sling, and he would need months of physical therapy to regain even partial use of his shoulder. The claw wounds had healed well enough to remove the stitches, leaving behind 4 parallel scars across his chest that would serve as permanent reminders of his encounter with one of nature's most powerful predators. The flight back to Boise was George's first time in an airplane since the attack, and he found the experience more stressful than he had anticipated. Every sound of the engines, every bit of turbulence seemed to trigger his newly heightened anxiety response. By the time the plane touched down in Idaho, he was exhausted and emotionally drained. His wife, Patricia, met him at the airport with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had flown to Kodiak immediately after receiving word of the attack and had spent several days at his bedside before returning home to prepare for his recovery. Seeing him walk off the plane under his own power was a moment she had been praying for since that terrible phone call 2 weeks earlier. "How are you feeling?" she asked as they drove home through the familiar landscape of the Boise foothills. "Grateful to be alive," George replied, though his voice carried an undertone of something she couldn't quite identify, "and wondering if I'll ever feel normal again." The question of normalcy would dominate George's thoughts for months to come. The physical recovery progressed slowly but steadily, with twice-weekly physical therapy sessions, gradually restoring strength and mobility to his damaged shoulder. The psychological recovery proved more challenging, involving not just the trauma of the attack itself, but also a fundamental reassessment of his relationship with the wilderness that had been such an important part of his identity. For 40 years, George had found peace and purpose in hunting. The wilderness had been his refuge from the stresses of business and family life, a place where he could test himself against the natural world and come away feeling more connected to something larger than himself. The attack had shattered that sense of confidence and control, replacing it with a visceral understanding of just how quickly the hunter could become the hunted. 3 months after the attack, as winter settled over the mountains of Idaho, George received a phone call that brought the entire experience full circle. Tom Bradley, the Fish and Game enforcement officer who had led the search for the bear, was calling with an update that George had been both hoping for and dreading. "We found him," Bradley said without preamble. "A trapper working the area came across the carcass about 2 weeks ago. It was the right bear. Size matches your description perfectly, and the bullet wounds are consistent with your rifle." George felt a complex mixture of emotions wash over him. Relief that the dangerous animal was no longer a threat to other hunters. Sadness for the magnificent creature that had died as a result of their encounter. And a strange sense of closure that came from knowing the story had a definitive ending. "Where did you find him?" George asked. "About 6 miles from where the attack occurred, in a dense thicket beside a small lake. Based on the decomposition and the amount of scavenging by other animals, he probably died within a day or 2 of the encounter. Your shots did more damage than we initially thought." The news meant that the hunting area closure could be lifted and normal activities could resume. It also meant that George's account of the encounter had been fully validated. He had indeed faced a massive brown bear in its prime, had wounded it with good shot placement, and had survived an attack by one of the most dangerous predators in North America. But the validation brought little satisfaction. George found himself thinking not about the size of the bear or the trophy potential it had represented, but about the magnificent animal dying alone in the wilderness, wounded and suffering because of a decision he had made in a moment of excitement and ambition. "I think I'm done," he told Patricia that evening as they sat by the fireplace in their living room. "I don't think I want to hunt anymore." She reached over and took his hand, careful not to disturb the scars that still marked his knuckles from the attack. "Are you sure? Hunting has been such a big part of your life." George looked out the window at the snow-covered mountains that had called to him since childhood. "Maybe that's the problem. I've been thinking about what happened up there, and I realize I wasn't hunting. I was just killing. There's a difference, and I lost sight of it somewhere along the way." The conversation marked the beginning of a new chapter in George's life, one in which his relationship with the outdoors would be redefined by respect and observation rather than pursuit and conquest. He would continue to spend time in the wilderness, but as a photographer and naturalist rather than a hunter. The camera replaced the rifle as his primary tool for capturing the essence of wild places and the animals that lived there. Anthony, meanwhile, made his own difficult decision about the future of his guiding business. While the investigation had cleared him of any wrongdoing, he found that the weight of responsibility for George's injuries was more than he could bear. 6 months after the attack, he sold his share of Kodiak Adventures to Marcus Chen and took a job with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game as a wildlife education specialist. "I still love the wilderness," he explained to friends who questioned his career change. "But I think I can do more good teaching people about wildlife safety than I can leading them into situations where things can go wrong." His new position involved developing educational programs for hunters, hikers, and other outdoor enthusiasts, teaching them how to minimize conflicts with bears and other dangerous wildlife. He drew extensively on his experience from that October day, using the lessons learned from George's encounter to help others avoid similar situations. The story of the Kodiak bear attack became part of Alaska folklore, told and retold around campfires and in hunting lodges throughout the state. But for those who lived through it, the story was more than just a tale of adventure and survival. It was a reminder of the thin line between civilization and wilderness, between predator and prey, between life and death. In the years that followed, both George and Anthony would be asked countless times to recount the details of their encounter with the massive brown bear. Each telling would be slightly different as memories evolved and perspectives changed with time and distance. But the core truth of the story remained constant. In the wilderness, humans are guests in a world governed by rules far older and more fundamental than civilization. The bear they encountered that day was estimated to have been between 15 and 20 years old, making him one of the oldest and largest brown bears ever documented on Kodiak Island. He had survived through multiple hunting seasons, harsh winters, territorial disputes with other bears, and all the other challenges that defined life in the Alaskan wilderness. He was by any measure a magnificent example of his species. The fact that their encounter ended in violence and death was not a failure of the bear, nor entirely a failure of the humans involved. It was simply the result of two species occupying the same space at the same time, each following instincts and behaviors that had been shaped by millions of years of evolution. The tragedy was not that such encounters occurred, but that modern humans had largely forgotten how to coexist peacefully with the wild creatures that still inhabited the remote corners of the world. Dr. Sarah Thompson, the bear behavior specialist, who had interviewed Anthony after the attack, would later write a research paper about the incident that was published in the Journal of Wildlife Management. Her analysis concluded that the encounter represented a perfect storm of factors that combined to create a dangerous situation. A dominant male bear defending prime feeding territory during the critical pre-denning period, hunters who underestimated the animal's aggressive potential, and terrain that provided little opportunity for escape or evasion. This case illustrates the importance of understanding not just bear behavior in general, but the specific behavioral patterns of Kodiak brown bears, she wrote. These animals have evolved in isolation for thousands of years and exhibit aggressive tendencies that are significantly greater than those of brown bears in other parts of Alaska or North America. Her recommendations, based partly on George and Anthony's experience, led to changes in hunting regulations for Kodiak Island. New requirements included mandatory bear safety training for all hunters, stricter guidelines for guide-client ratios in prime bear habitat, and enhanced reporting requirements for any encounters with aggressive wildlife. The insurance settlement from George's injuries took nearly 2 years to resolve, involving complex negotiations between multiple companies and extensive legal review of the circumstances surrounding the attack. The final settlement, which remained confidential, was sufficient to cover his medical expenses and provide compensation for his permanent disabilities. But no amount of money could restore his full physical capabilities or erase the psychological trauma of the encounter. George used a portion of the settlement to establish a wildlife education foundation that provided funding for research into human-bear conflicts and safety training programs for outdoor enthusiasts. The foundation's mission statement read, "To promote understanding and respect for wildlife through education, research, and the sharing of experiences that illustrate both the beauty and danger of our remaining wild places." The first project funded by the foundation was a comprehensive study of bear encounters in Alaska, designed to identify patterns and risk factors that could help prevent future attacks. The research, conducted by the University of Alaska Fairbanks in partnership with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, tracked more than 500 bear encounters over a 3-year period and developed new guidelines for hunters, hikers, and other wilderness users. Anthony served as a consultant on the project, providing insights based on his decades of experience guiding hunters in bear country. His contributions helped shape safety protocols that emphasize situational awareness, proper food storage, and the importance of understanding bear behavior in different seasonal and environmental contexts. Every bear encounter is unique, Anthony would tell the hunters and outdoor enthusiasts who attended his safety seminars. But there are patterns and warning signs that can help you avoid dangerous situations. The key is learning to read the environment and the animals in it, and always having an escape plan. His seminars became increasingly popular throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, drawing audiences that included not just hunters, but also hikers, campers, wildlife photographers, and anyone else who spent time in bear country. The program he developed, called Living with Bears, became a model for wildlife safety education that was adopted by park services and wildlife agencies across North America. 5 years after the attack, George returned to Alaska for the first time since his medical evacuation. The trip was not for hunting, but for a photography expedition focused on documenting the wildlife and landscapes of the region where he had nearly died. The journey represented a form of closure, a way of reclaiming positive memories of a place that had been defined in his mind by trauma and violence. He flew into Kodiak on a clear October morning, almost exactly 5 years to the day after his encounter with the massive brown bear. The landscape looked exactly as he remembered it. Pristine wilderness stretching in all directions, mountains rising from coastal waters, forests that seemed to pulse with life. Anthony met him at the airport, and together they traveled by float plane to the same remote lake where their hunting expedition had begun half a decade earlier. But this time, instead of rifles and hunting gear, they carried cameras and binoculars. Instead of seeking to take life from the wilderness, they hoped to capture its essence and beauty. The area around Karluk Lake showed no visible signs of their previous visit. Nature had reclaimed the site of their base camp, erasing all evidence of human presence with the inexorable power of wind, rain, and growing vegetation. It was a reminder of how small and temporary human presence was in this vast landscape. They hiked to the canyon where the attack had occurred, following the same game trail they had used 5 years earlier. George felt his heart rate increase as they approached the familiar terrain, and he had to stop several times to manage the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. But he was determined to complete the journey, to face the place where his life had changed forever. The canyon looked smaller than he remembered, less threatening in the bright afternoon sunlight. The rock formation where he had been pinned by the massive bear was still there, unmarked by the violence that had occurred beside it. The stream continued to flow, as it had for thousands of years, carrying salmon from the ocean to their spawning grounds in the mountains. "It's just a place," George said, more to himself than to Anthony. "Just rocks and water and trees. I've given it more power over me than it deserves." They spent an hour in the canyon, with George photographing the landscape from multiple angles, while Anthony shared his own memories of that terrifying day. The conversation was cathartic for both men, allowing them to process emotions and perspectives that had been difficult to discuss in the immediate aftermath of the attack. "I've always wondered if we could have done something different," Anthony said as they prepared to leave the canyon. "Some decision that would have prevented the whole thing from happening." George considered the question, one that had haunted his own thoughts for years. "Maybe. But I think we made the best choices we could with what we knew at the time. The bear was just being a bear, doing what millions of years of evolution had programmed him to do. We were the variables in the equation." As they hiked back toward the lake, where their float plane waited, they encountered fresh bear sign along the trail, tracks in the mud, claw marks on trees, and the partially consumed carcass of a salmon. The wilderness continued to support the same wildlife populations that had existed when they first visited, including the massive brown bears that remained the apex predators of this ecosystem. "They're still here," George observed, photographing a particularly clear bear track beside the trail. "Still living their lives, following the same patterns their ancestors followed for thousands of years." "Does that bother you?" Anthony asked. George thought about the question as he adjusted his camera settings for the changing light. Number. "It's actually comforting. What happened to us was just a single moment in the ongoing story of this place. The bears didn't learn to hate humans because of our encounter, and I shouldn't learn to hate them because of what one individual did when he felt threatened." The photography expedition yielded images that would later be displayed in galleries in Boise, Anchorage, and Seattle. George's photographs captured not just the raw beauty of the Alaskan wilderness, but also the sense of respect and humility that had replaced his earlier desire to dominate and possess. The exhibition, titled Coexistence, included written accounts of his bear encounter alongside images that celebrated the wildness and freedom of the animals that had nearly killed him. Anthony continued his work in wildlife education, eventually becoming the Alaska Department of Fish and Game's Chief Training Officer for human-wildlife conflict prevention. His programs expanded beyond bear safety to include education about moose encounters, wolf behavior, and the complex challenges of living and recreating in areas inhabited by large predators. The safety protocols he helped develop were credited with reducing bear encounters throughout Alaska by more than 30% over a 5-year period. His work earned recognition from wildlife management agencies across North America, and he was invited to share his expertise at conferences and training programs throughout the United States and Canada. "The goal isn't to eliminate all risk," he would tell his audiences. "That's impossible when you're dealing with wild animals in their natural habitat. The goal is to understand the risks and manage them intelligently so that humans and wildlife can coexist in the same landscapes." His message resonated with a growing movement of outdoor enthusiasts who sought to experience wilderness without dominating or disrupting it. The traditional model of hunting as conquest was gradually giving way to a more nuanced understanding of humans as temporary visitors in ecosystems that belonged ultimately to the wildlife that lived there year-round. The massive brown bear that had attacked George was eventually mounted by a taxidermist in Anchorage, using measurements and photographs taken during the recovery of the carcass. The mount, which showed the animal standing at its full height of 9 feet and 8 inches, was displayed in the Alaska Department of Fish and Game offices as part of an educational exhibit about bear safety and behavior. The display included detailed information about the encounter, told from the perspectives of both the hunters and the wildlife biologists who investigated the incident. Visitors could read about the factors that led to the attack, the rescue operation that saved George's life, and the lessons learned that had improved safety protocols for future wilderness users. This bear lived for approximately 18 years in the wilderness of Kodiak Island, read the text accompanying the display. He survived harsh winters, territorial disputes, and all the other challenges that define life for Alaska's brown bears. His encounter with hunters in October 2025 represented a single moment in a life spent following instincts shaped by thousands of years of evolution. His death was not a failure of wildness, but a reminder of the fundamental differences between human and animal perspectives on the same landscape. The educational exhibit became one of the most popular displays at the Fish and Game offices, drawing thousands of visitors each year who wanted to see the massive bear and learn about the encounter that had nearly cost George his life. Many visitors left with a changed perspective on wildlife and wilderness, understanding for the first time the complexity of relationships between humans and large predators. Dr. Boster, the emergency room physician who had treated George's injuries, eventually wrote a medical journal article about the case that became required reading for emergency medicine residents throughout Alaska. Her paper, titled "Management of Brown Bear Attack Injuries, a Case Study in Wilderness Trauma," provided detailed analysis of the medical challenges involved in treating victims of large predator attacks. The key to successful treatment of bear attack victims is rapid stabilization of blood loss and immediate transportation to definitive care, she wrote. But equally important is understanding the psychological trauma that accompanies such encounters. Physical wounds heal. Psychological wounds require ongoing attention and professional intervention. Her research contributed to improved protocols for wilderness medical evacuations and helped establish new standards for trauma care in remote locations. The case also highlighted the importance of wilderness first aid training for anyone spending extended time in areas inhabited by large predators. 10 years after the attack, George Wallace published a memoir titled "When the Hunter Becomes the Hunted: Lessons from a Brown Bear Encounter." The book combined his personal account of the attack and recovery with broader reflections on humanity's relationship with wilderness and wildlife. It became a bestseller among outdoor enthusiasts and was adopted as required reading by several university programs in wildlife management and outdoor recreation. "I went to Alaska to prove something to myself," George wrote in the book's conclusion. I wanted to test my skills and courage against one of nature's most dangerous predators. What I learned instead was that courage isn't about dominating the natural world. It's about learning to live respectfully within it. The book's success led to speaking engagements across the country, where George shared his story with audiences ranging from hunting clubs to environmental organizations. His message evolved over the years, but its core remained constant. Humans and wildlife could coexist, but only if people were willing to approach the wilderness with humility and respect, rather than arrogance and dominance. Anthony eventually retired from his position with Fish and Game, but continued to work as a consultant for wildlife agencies and outdoor education programs. His legacy was the network of safety protocols and training programs that had prevented countless potential tragedies throughout Alaska and beyond. Every person who goes into bear country and comes home safely represents a success, he said during his retirement ceremony. Not because they avoided bears, but because they learned to share the landscape respectfully with the animals that call it home. The story of George Wallace and Anthony Perez's encounter with the massive Kodiak brown bear became more than just a tale of survival and tragedy. It became a parable about the relationship between modern humans and the wild world that still existed in places like Alaska, a reminder that wilderness was not a theme park designed for human entertainment, but a functioning ecosystem inhabited by creatures that demanded respect and understanding. In the years that followed, both men would look back on that October day as a turning point that had redirected their lives in ways they never could have anticipated. The attack had taken something from each of them. George's sense of physical invulnerability, Anthony's confidence in his ability to control dangerous situations. But it had also given them something invaluable, a deep understanding of their place in the natural world, and a commitment to sharing that understanding with others. The massive brown bear that had nearly killed George continued to live on in the stories told about him, in the safety protocols developed because of the encounter, and in the changed perspectives of the thousands of people who learned about wildlife and wilderness through the educational programs his attack had inspired. In death, he had become a teacher, helping humans understand the respect and caution that life in bear country demanded. The wilderness of Kodiak Island remained unchanged by the drama that had unfolded there. New generations of brown bears continued to fish the same streams, follow the same trails, and defend the same territories that their ancestors had claimed for thousands of years. They lived and died according to the ancient rhythms of the natural world, largely unaware of the impact their kind had on the humans who occasionally ventured into their domain. For those humans brave enough or foolish enough to seek out encounters with such powerful creatures, the story of George Wallace's bear attack served as both warning and inspiration. It illustrated the very real dangers that existed in wild places, but also the profound transformation that was possible when humans learned to approach the natural world with appropriate humility and respect. The massive claw marks that the bear had left on George's chest faded over time, becoming barely visible reminders of an encounter that had changed his life forever. But the psychological scars remained, not as sources of trauma, but as touchstones that reminded him daily of his mortality and his connection to a world larger and more powerful than human civilization. In the end, the story of the Kodiak bear attack was not really about violence or survival, though it certainly contained both elements. It was about the possibility of coexistence between species that had evolved along very different paths, and the wisdom that could emerge from encounters that forced humans to confront their true place in the natural order. The bear had been following instincts programmed by millions of years of evolution when he attacked the hunters who had wounded him. The humans had been following instincts shaped by thousands of years of hunting culture when they pursued a trophy that represented the ultimate test of their skills and courage. The collision between these two sets of instincts had nearly resulted in death, but it had ultimately led to understanding. As George would write in his memoir, "The bear didn't attack me because he was evil or malicious. He attacked me because I represented a threat in his world, and he responded the only way he knew how. My mistake was thinking that 40 years of hunting experience made me the predator in that encounter. The truth is that in the wilderness, we are all prey." The next stories. July 20th, 2025. Kodiak bear mauls 3 campers to death in midnight rampage. The headline would scream across every major news outlet within 12 hours, but at 11:47 p.m. on July 19th, as the first screams pierced the pristine silence of Afognak Island's northwestern shore, the only witnesses were the ancient Sitka spruces that had stood sentinel over countless tragedies in their 300-year lifespans. The massive trees, their bark scarred by decades of bear claws, would soon bear witness to something far worse than the typical salmon-spawning disputes they had observed each summer for generations. Dr. Lisa Marie Harper had been dead for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds when the 1,200-pound male Kodiak bear finally released her mangled torso from his jaws. The forensic timeline would later establish this with disturbing precision based on the exact moment her Garmin smartwatch stopped recording her elevated heart rate at 11:51 p.m. Her final heartbeat registered at 187 beats per minute, a number that would haunt the investigation team for months to come. The watch, somehow still functional despite being splattered with arterial blood, would become Exhibit A in a case that would fundamentally change wilderness camping regulations across Alaska. 3 days earlier, on July 16th, 2025, the tragedy had begun as nothing more than an ambitious vacation plan. The Alaska Marine Highway ferry Tustumena cut through the choppy waters of Shelikof Strait, carrying what appeared to be just another group of young professionals seeking adventure in the last frontier. The morning sun cast long shadows across the vessel's weathered deck as Lisa Harper stood at the port rail, her strawberry blonde hair whipping in the salt-tinged wind. At 27, she possessed the lean, athletic build of someone who spent more time on mountain trails than in conference rooms, though her position as a senior wildlife biologist for the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife meant she did plenty of both. "Look at the size of those mountains," she called to her companions, pointing toward the jagged peaks of Kodiak Island, rising from the morning mist like the spine of some prehistoric beast. The Kodiak Island archipelago is home to the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world. We're talking about animals that can reach up to 1,500 pounds in the wild. Her voice carried the enthusiasm of someone who had spent years studying these magnificent predators from the safety of research stations and helicopter surveys, never imagining that in 72 hours she would experience their raw power in the most intimate and terrifying way possible. Brian David Cole emerged from the ferry's interior, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and wearing the kind of expensive outdoor gear that marked him as someone who took his wilderness adventures seriously. At 31, he had the weathered hands of a commercial fishing captain and the steady demeanor that came with 6 years of navigating Alaska's treacherous waters. His company, Arctic Dawn Fishing Charters, had given him intimate knowledge of these waters and their dangers, but bears were a different matter entirely. "The captain says we'll dock at Kodiak in about 2 hours, he announced, handing Lisa one of the cups. "Weather's supposed to hold for the next 4 days, which gives us plenty of time to hike the Afognak River Trail and set up camp at Devil's Prong." Dylan James Matthews looked up from where he was adjusting the straps on an enormous backpack that seemed to dwarf his lean frame. At 22, He was the youngest of the group and the most eager to prove himself in Alaska's wilderness. A recent graduate of the University of Oregon's forestry program, Dylan had convinced his girlfriend Sarah to let him spend his savings on this trip by promising it would help him land a job with the Alaska Department of Natural Resources. His hiking boots were new enough to still show the manufacturer's label, and his enthusiasm was infectious, even as it revealed his inexperience. "I've been reading about Devil's Prong for months," he said, consulting a well-worn guidebook. "It's supposedly one of the most pristine camping areas in the archipelago. The fishing is incredible, and the bear activity is usually minimal this time of year since the salmon runs haven't peaked yet." The irony of that statement would later be noted by Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the chief wildlife biologist who would head the post-incident investigation. In her preliminary report, she would write, "Subject exhibited classic confirmation bias regarding seasonal bear behavior patterns. While salmon runs typically peak in August, July presents unique challenges as bears are in hyperphagic state, actively seeking high-calorie food sources in preparation for winter hibernation. Campsites near river systems present elevated risk during this period." Her clinical language would barely hint at the horror that unfolded when Dylan's optimistic assessment collided with the reality of a starving predator. Joining the core trio were 11 other members of what had been christened the Kodiak Adventure Group during the planning stages 6 months earlier. The expedition had been organized by Rebecca Becker Martinez, a 34-year-old adventure travel blogger whose Instagram account, Alaska or Bust, had amassed over 100,000 followers eager for vicarious wilderness thrills. Becca had convinced her audience that a group camping expedition to Afognak Island would make for incredible content, combining wildlife photography with extreme outdoor adventure. Her live streams from the ferry had already garnered thousands of views, with comments ranging from excitement to warnings about bear safety that she had largely dismissed as typical internet fear-mongering. Dr. Marcus Thompson, 41, served as the group's de facto medical officer. An emergency room physician from Seattle Presbyterian Hospital, he had volunteered for the role after Becca posted about needing someone with medical training for the expedition. Marcus had extensive wilderness medicine training and had served as medical support for several Everest expeditions, but his expertise lay primarily with altitude-related injuries and hypothermia. Nothing in his background had prepared him for the massive trauma injuries that would soon test every aspect of his medical knowledge under the most primitive conditions imaginable. The group's unofficial bear expert was supposed to be James Bear Kowalski, a 47-year-old former park ranger whose 23 years of experience in Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks had given him extensive knowledge of grizzly behavior. Bear's presence had been a major selling point for several group members who were nervous about camping in Kodiak territory. What they didn't know was that Kodiak bears, while closely related to interior grizzlies, exhibited significantly different behavioral patterns, particularly regarding aggression toward humans. Bear's expertise, while extensive, was about to prove tragically inadequate for the subspecies they would encounter. Among the other group members were Jennifer Walsh, 29, a professional photographer from Portland whose landscape work had been featured in National Geographic. Her boyfriend, Kevin Santos, 32, a software engineer whose outdoor experience was limited, but whose enthusiasm was boundless. Amanda Foster, 26, a nurse practitioner whose medical skills would complement Dr. Thompson's training. And twins Michael and Matthew Chen, both 28, whose shared passion for extreme sports had led them to attempt everything from base jumping to ice climbing. The remaining members included Sarah Elizabeth Hendricks, Dylan's girlfriend, who at 24 was pursuing her master's degree in environmental science and had been documenting the trip for her thesis on human-wildlife interactions. Craig Williams, 35, a commercial pilot whose small aircraft charter service had given him aerial views of Alaska's wilderness, but limited ground experience, and Robert Bobby Jackson, a 43-year-old mechanic from Anchorage whose hunting experience was supposed to provide additional safety expertise. As the ferry approached Kodiak Island's main harbor, the group gathered on deck to review their final plans. Becca live-streamed the approach, her phone camera capturing the pristine wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. "We're about to embark on what's going to be the adventure of a lifetime," she announced to her viewers. 14 people, 4 days, and some of the most spectacular wilderness Alaska has to offer. And yes, for everyone asking about bears, we have 2 wildlife experts with us and all the proper safety equipment. The comments section filled with bear emojis and warnings, but the excitement was palpable. What none of them could see, and what wouldn't be discovered until the post-incident investigation 3 weeks later, was the massive male Kodiak bear known to researchers as K137, a 1,200-pound dominant male whose territory encompassed the entire Devil's Prong area. K137 had been fitted with a radio collar by Fish and Game biologists 2 years earlier, and the tracking data would later reveal a disturbing pattern. The bear had been exhibiting increasingly aggressive behavior toward humans since early June, likely due to a combination of poor salmon runs, competition from younger males, and a partially healed injury to his left front paw that had made his normal foraging techniques less effective. Dr. Reynolds' post-incident analysis would identify several critical factors that contributed to the coming tragedy. The unseasonably warm weather had pushed berry ripening ahead of schedule, causing bears to seek alternative food sources earlier than usual. Additionally, recent construction at a nearby fish processing facility had disrupted traditional feeding patterns, forcing bears into new territories where they were more likely to encounter humans. Most critically, K137's radio collar had malfunctioned in early July, leaving wildlife managers unaware of his presence in the Devil's Prong area. The ferry's approach to Kodiak Harbor took them past several small islands where seals basked on rocky outcroppings, seemingly oblivious to the massive predators that shared their habitat. Lisa pointed out various landmarks to her companions, her scientific training evident in her detailed explanations of the ecosystem they were entering. The Kodiak archipelago supports the highest density of brown bears in the world, she explained, her words carrying an ominous weight that none of them fully appreciated. We're talking about 1 bear per square mile in some areas. They're incredibly intelligent, with problem-solving abilities that rival primates, and they have spatial memory that allows them to return to food sources years later. Dylan, documenting everything in a journal he planned to turn into his job application essay, wrote furiously as Lisa spoke. His notes from that day would later be entered into evidence, including the chilling observation, "Lisa says bears remember everything. Wonder if they remember campsites where they've found food before." The question would prove more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. The harbor at Kodiak buzzed with activity as fishing boats unloaded their catches and tourists prepared for various adventures. The group's chartered float plane, a de Havilland Beaver piloted by local legend Captain Tom Morrison, bobbed gently at the dock. Morrison, 73, had been flying in Alaska since 1967 and had seen every conceivable wilderness scenario. His weathered face carried the wisdom of thousands of flights over some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth, and his safety briefings were legendary for their blunt honesty about the risks they were all accepting. "This isn't Yellowstone," Morrison announced as the group loaded their gear into the Beaver's cargo compartment. "Kodiak bears are bigger, stronger, and more aggressive than anything you've encountered. They don't spook easily, and they don't back down. Your bear spray is your lifeline, but only if you know how to use it properly. Most people panic and spray too early or too late. The effective range is about 20 feet, and you get about 8 seconds of spray. Miss, and you're done. His words would echo in the survivors' minds for months afterward. Bear Kowalski nodded along with Morrison's briefing, but privately felt confident in his ability to handle any bear encounter. His experience with Yellowstone grizzlies had taught him to read bear body language and avoid confrontations before they escalated. What he didn't understand was that Kodiak bears, with their larger size and different food sources, exhibited behavioral patterns that differed significantly from their inland cousins. This gap in knowledge would prove fatal for 3 members of the group. The flight to Afognak Island took 47 minutes, carrying them over spectacular wilderness that few humans ever experienced. Below them, pristine lakes reflected the afternoon sun like scattered mirrors, while rivers carved silver ribbons through valleys that had remained unchanged for millennia. Morrison pointed out landmarks as they flew, including the Afognak River system where they planned to camp. "See that bend in the river about 2 miles upstream from your campsite," he called over the engine noise. "That's prime bear habitat. Salmon start stacking up there in preparation for spawning. If I were you, I'd stay well clear of that area." Dr. Thompson, studying topographical maps in preparation for any medical emergencies, noted the distance from their planned campsite to the nearest medical facility. "Kodiak Hospital is about 60 miles away," he announced to the group. "In case of serious injury, we're looking at a minimum 90-minute response time for emergency evacuation, assuming weather conditions permit flying." He paused, reviewing his emergency medical supplies one final time. "I've got enough trauma supplies to handle most wilderness injuries, but everyone needs to understand that we're essentially on our own out there." The float plane touched down on Devil's Lake at 3:24 p.m. on July 16th, creating ripples that spread across the mirror-smooth surface like expanding circles of fate. Morrison taxied to a small gravel beach that served as the unofficial landing area for the handful of adventurous souls who ventured into this remote corner of Alaska each year. The silence that enveloped them as the engine shut down was profound, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the pontoons and the distant cry of a bald eagle circling overhead. As the group unloaded their gear, Morrison conducted his final safety briefing. "I'll be back to pick you up at 2 p.m. on July 20th, weather permitting. You've got my satellite phone number, but only use it for genuine emergencies. Help is expensive out here, and rescue operations put other people at risk." He surveyed the eager faces around him, noting the mixture of excitement and nervousness that characterized every group he'd flown into the wilderness. "Remember, you're guests in this country. The bears were here long before us, and they'll be here long after we're gone. Respect them, give them space, and maybe you'll all go home with stories instead of scars." The afternoon sun cast long shadows as the Beaver lifted off and disappeared into the vast Alaskan sky, leaving 14 people alone in one of the most remote wilderness areas in North America. The sound of the aircraft engine faded into the distance, replaced by the pristine silence of the wilderness, punctuated only by the gentle murmur of the Afognak River and the occasional splash of jumping salmon. Lisa stood at the water's edge, watching the salmon runs that had drawn both humans and bears to this remote valley for thousands of years. The fish moved in silvery clouds beneath the surface, their instinctive drive to reach their spawning grounds as powerful as the forces that had brought the human group to this same location. "The salmon runs are definitely more active than I expected for mid-July," she observed, making notes in her field journal. "This could mean increased bear activity as they follow the fish upstream." "Do." Bear Kowalski was already surveying potential campsite locations, his experienced eye evaluating factors like wind direction, proximity to water, and sight lines that would allow early detection of approaching wildlife. "We want to set up at least 200 yards from the river," he announced. "Bears use the shoreline as a highway, especially at night. We'll establish a triangle formation with our tents, cooking area, and food storage, each at least 100 yards apart." His systematic approach reflected decades of wilderness experience, though it would ultimately prove insufficient against the particular threat they were about to face. The group spent the remainder of the afternoon establishing their camp according to Bear's specifications. The tent area was situated on a slight rise that provided good drainage and visibility in multiple directions. The cooking area was located downwind from the tents, with a carefully constructed bear-proof food storage system that involved hoisting all scented items at least 15 feet high and 6 feet from any tree trunk. Everyone participated in the setup with the kind of enthusiastic efficiency that marked the beginning of a great adventure. Dylan and Sarah worked together to establish their tent, a high-end mountaineering model that Sarah had received as a graduation gift from her parents. As they drove stakes into the rocky soil, Dylan maintained a running commentary for the video diary he was creating for his job application. "Day 1 at Devil's Prong, and the setup is going perfectly," he announced to his camera. "The landscape here is absolutely incredible, and our safety protocols are military grade. Bear Kowalski has thought of everything." The confidence in his voice would make the video painful to watch for his family members in the weeks to come. As evening approached, the group gathered around their camp stove for their first meal in the wilderness. Becca live-streamed portions of the dinner preparation, showing her followers the dehydrated camping meals that would sustain them for the next 4 days. "The freeze-dried technology has come so far," she explained to her audience. "These meals actually taste good, and they're designed to provide maximum nutrition for outdoor athletes." The comments section filled with questions about bear safety, but Becca focused on the positive aspects of their adventure, maintaining the upbeat tone that had made her channel popular. Dr. Thompson used the dinner break to review emergency procedures with the group one final time. "In case of medical emergency, my supplies are in the red bag next to my tent," he announced. "I've got trauma supplies, pain medication, and antibiotics that can handle most wilderness injuries. But remember, prevention is always better than treatment out here." He looked around at the 14 faces illuminated by their camp stove, unable to know that in 3 days his medical training would be tested in ways that no textbook could have prepared him for. As darkness settled over Devil's Prong, the group experienced the profound silence that only Alaska's wilderness could provide. The nearest human habitation was over 40 miles away, and the absence of any artificial light pollution revealed a sky blazing with stars that few people in the modern world ever experienced. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, creating a backdrop so beautiful that several group members spent hours photographing the celestial display. Jennifer Walsh set up her professional camera equipment to capture long exposure shots of the night sky, her telephoto lenses and tripods creating an impressive array of technology in the primitive setting. "The light pollution back home makes it impossible to see stars like this," she explained to Kevin as they worked together to frame the perfect shot. "This is the kind of night that makes you understand why early humans were so fascinated by astronomy." Her photographs from that first night would later be featured in several magazines, though the tragic context would overshadow their artistic merit. The group's sleep schedule that first night was fragmented, partly due to excitement and partly due to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness. Every snapping twig or rustling bush triggered heightened awareness, though none of the sounds indicated the presence of the large predators they were unconsciously listening for. Bear Kowalski made regular rounds of the camp perimeter, his flashlight beam sweeping through the darkness as he checked for any signs of wildlife activity. At approximately 2:15 a.m. on July 17th, Kevin Santos was awakened by what he later described as a sound like heavy breathing just outside our tent. He lay motionless for several minutes, listening intently, but the sound was not repeated. In his statement to investigators 3 weeks later, Kevin would wonder if he had actually heard the first reconnaissance visit by K-137, the massive bear who was already beginning to investigate the unusual concentration of human scent in his territory. The investigation would later reveal that K-137 had likely made his first pass through the campsite during the early morning hours of July 17th, drawn by the unfamiliar smells and sounds. Bears possess an extraordinary sense of smell, estimated to be 7 times more sensitive than a bloodhound's, and the combination of 14 different human scents, plus cooking odors and soap fragrances, would have created an olfactory signature unlike anything the bear had previously encountered. Dawn on July 17th brought crystalline skies and the promise of perfect hiking weather. The group woke to temperatures in the low 50s, with light winds and unlimited visibility across the dramatic landscape. Lisa was the first to emerge from her tent, drawn by the sounds of increased salmon activity in the nearby river. Her field glasses revealed dozens of fish moving upstream in waves, their silver bodies flashing in the early morning sunlight. "The salmon runs are definitely heavier than expected," she announced, as other group members gathered around the camp stove for coffee and breakfast. "This is actually fascinating from a research perspective, but it also means we need to be extra vigilant about bear activity. Heavy salmon runs can draw bears from territories much farther away than we might expect." Her scientific observations were accurate, though she couldn't have known that K-137 had already been drawn to the area and was at that moment watching their camp from a ridge approximately 400 yards away. The planned activities for July 17th included a day hike along the Afognak River Trail, wildlife photography, and establishing the group's routine for the remainder of their stay. Bear Kowalski briefed everyone on hiking safety protocols, emphasizing the importance of making noise to avoid surprising any bears and staying together as a group. "Bears generally want to avoid human contact as much as we want to avoid them," he explained. "The key is making sure they know we're here and giving them plenty of space to retreat." Dylan and Sarah volunteered to take point on the day's hike, their youthful enthusiasm making them natural leaders for the group's adventures. Dylan's forestry training had given him skills in trail navigation and wilderness observation that complemented Sarah's academic knowledge of wildlife behavior. Together, they created an effective scouting team that could identify potential hazards and interesting features along their route. The Afognak River Trail wound through some of the most spectacular wilderness scenery any of the group had ever experienced. Ancient Sitka spruces, some over 300 years old, created a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the morning sunlight into golden beams. The understory was thick with devil's club, blueberry bushes, and ferns that created perfect habitat for the numerous small mammals that formed the bottom of the local food chain. Approximately 2 miles into their hike, Jennifer Walsh spotted what appeared to be fresh bear scat on the trail. Bear Kowalski examined the droppings carefully, noting their size and composition. "This is from a large bear, probably male, and it's no more than 12 hours old," he announced. "The scat contains fish remains, which means he's been feeding on salmon recently. Everyone needs to increase their noise level and stay close together." The discovery added an element of excitement to the hike, though none of them realized they were examining evidence of K-137's presence in the immediate area. The group's hiking formation spread out over approximately 50 yards, with Dylan and Sarah in the lead, followed by the main group, and Bear Kowalski bringing up the rear to watch for any wildlife approaching from behind. This formation, while standard for wilderness hiking, would later be criticized by experts who argued that the group was too large and too spread out for effective bear encounter management. During the midday rest stop, the group gathered at a scenic overlook that provided panoramic views of the river valley and the surrounding mountains. Becca used the opportunity to create content for her followers, interviewing various group members about their experiences so far. "We're living the absolute dream out here," she announced to her camera. "The scenery is beyond description, the wildlife is incredible, and our safety protocols are absolutely solid. For anyone thinking about an Alaska adventure, this is exactly what you should be planning." Dr. Thompson spent the rest break reviewing the group's physical condition and addressing minor issues like blisters and muscle soreness. "Everyone's adapting well to the physical demands," he noted in his medical log. "No significant injuries or health concerns at this point. The biggest risk factors remain environmental hazards and wildlife encounters." His clinical assessment was accurate, though he couldn't have anticipated the specific nature of the wildlife encounter that was approaching. The afternoon portion of the hike took them closer to the salmon spawning areas, where the fish activity was even more intense than they had observed from camp. The sound of jumping salmon filled the air, creating a constant background noise that masked other sounds in the environment. Lisa documented the salmon behavior extensively, noting species composition and approximate numbers for the research paper she planned to write about the trip. "This level of salmon activity is remarkable for mid-July," she observed, photographing the spawning areas from a safe distance upstream. "It suggests that environmental factors are pushing the runs earlier than normal, which could have significant implications for the entire ecosystem." Her scientific observations were creating valuable data, though the implications for bear behavior were becoming more serious than anyone realized. As the group prepared to return to camp, Kevin Santos discovered what appeared to be claw marks on a large Sitka spruce approximately 30 feet from the main trail. The marks were fresh, with sap still seeping from the gouges, and they extended from about 3 feet above ground level to nearly 8 feet high. Bear Kowalski examined the markings carefully, his expression growing increasingly serious as he assessed their implications. "These marks were made by a very large bear, probably within the last 24 hours, he announced. "The height and spacing of the claw marks suggest an animal significantly larger than the average Kodiak bear. We need to modify our camping protocols and consider shortening our stay." His recommendation was based on decades of experience with bear sign, though he still underestimated the specific threat that K-137 represented. The discussion that followed the discovery of the claw marks revealed significant differences in risk tolerance among the group members. Several people, led by Craig Williams and Bobby Jackson, argued for maintaining their original 4-day itinerary, pointing out that bear sign was normal in Kodiak habitat and didn't necessarily indicate immediate danger. Others, including Dr. Thompson and Amanda Foster, supported Bear Kowalski's recommendation for increased caution. "We've invested too much time and money in this trip to cut it short because of some claw marks," Craig argued. "Bears mark trees all the time. It's normal behavior that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with us." His position was shared by several other group members who had been looking forward to the adventure for months and were reluctant to abbreviate their experience based on what they saw as an abundance of caution. Lisa found herself in the difficult position of mediating between the scientific evidence and the group's desires for adventure. Her wildlife training told her that the combination of heavy salmon runs, fresh bear sign, and their group's large size created a potentially dangerous situation. However, her data also indicated that fatal bear attacks were statistically rare, and the presence of two experienced wilderness guides should provide adequate safety measures. The debate continued during the hike back to camp, with various group members weighing in based on their individual experience levels and risk tolerances. Becca argued for maintaining the original schedule, pointing out that her followers were expecting daily content from a 4-day adventure. Dylan and Sarah supported staying, partly because Dylan needed the full experience for his job application documentation. The Chen twins were eager to continue, viewing the bear activity as adding excitement rather than danger to their adventure. By the time they reached camp, a consensus had emerged to continue with the original itinerary while implementing enhanced safety protocols. These included posting guards during the night, moving the food storage even farther from the camping area, and maintaining closer group cohesion during all activities. Bear Kowalski agreed to the compromise reluctantly, though he insisted on radio contact with Kodiak authorities to report their situation and establish regular check-in times. The evening of July 17th passed without incident, though several group members reported hearing unusual sounds during the night. Michael Chen documented what he described as heavy footsteps passing near the tent area around 3 a.m., while Jennifer Walsh reported seeing large shadows moving between the trees during a bathroom break. These sightings were dismissed as normal nocturnal wildlife activity, though the post-incident investigation would suggest they represented K-137's second reconnaissance of the campsite. Dawn on July 18th brought overcast skies and a subtle change in the wilderness atmosphere that several group members noticed but couldn't quite define. The salmon activity in the river seemed more frantic, and the usual bird sounds were noticeably absent. Lisa attributed these changes to normal variations in wildlife behavior, though her field notes from that morning included the observation that something feels different about the ecosystem today. The planned activity for July 18th was an extended photography expedition to document the area's wildlife and scenery. Jennifer Walsh had identified several prime locations for landscape photography, while Lisa wanted to document the salmon spawning behavior in greater detail. The group split into two parties, with half remaining at the base camp to rest and organize equipment while the others embarked on the photography expedition. Dylan and Sarah chose to remain at camp, using the opportunity to organize their gear and work on the documentation Dylan needed for his job application. Their decision to stay behind while the photography group explored the area would save their lives, though they wouldn't realize this until the horrific events of the following evening unfolded. The next stories: Mountain's Shadow, a wilderness survival story. The morning mist clung to the jagged peaks of the coastal mountains like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the ancient granite faces that had stood sentinel over British Columbia's wilderness for millennia. Aaron Blake adjusted his headset and ran through his pre-flight checklist for the third time, his weathered hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who had spent the better part of 2 decades navigating these treacherous mountain corridors. At 46, Aaron had logged over 12,000 flight hours in search and rescue operations, each mission etching deeper lines around his steel-grey eyes and adding another story to his extensive repertoire of close calls and successful saves. The Bell 412 helicopter sat on the tarmac at Pemberton Regional Airport, its rotors still and silent in the pre-dawn calm. Aaron's flight suit bore the distinctive red and white patches of British Columbia Search and Rescue, an organization he had served with unwavering dedication since his discharge from the Canadian Armed Forces in 2003. His military background in the Royal Canadian Air Force had prepared him for the technical challenges of mountain flying, but nothing could have prepared him for the emotional weight of the lives that would rest in his hands over the years. Sarah Chen, The lead paramedic for today's mission approached the aircraft carrying 2 large medical kits and a portable stretcher. At 34, Sarah had been with BC Emergency Health Services for 8 years, specializing in wilderness medicine and high-altitude rescues. Her compact frame belied the strength required for her demanding profession, and her methodical approach to emergency medicine had earned her the respect of every pilot and rescue technician she had worked with. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail beneath her orange helmet, and her brown eyes held the focused intensity of someone who understood that every second could mean the difference between life and death. "Weather update looks favorable," Sarah called out as she secured her equipment in the cabin. "Visibility should improve as we gain altitude, and the forecast shows clear skies for the next 6 hours." Marcus Webb, the rescue technician, jogged across the tarmac, carrying additional rope and climbing gear. At 28, Marcus was the youngest member of their team, but had quickly established himself as one of the most skilled technical rescue specialists in the province. His background in mountaineering and rock climbing made him invaluable for the complex rope work often required in British Columbia's vertical terrain. Standing 6 feet tall, with the lean build of a dedicated climber, Marcus moved with the fluid grace of someone equally comfortable on solid ground or suspended hundreds of feet above a canyon floor. The mission they were responding to had come in at 03:47 hours. 3 hikers overdue on the West Ridge Trail of Mount Assiniboine, one reportedly injured with a suspected broken leg. The initial report had come from a satellite emergency beacon activation, providing coordinates but no details about the severity of the situation or the condition of the other hikers. The West Ridge Trail was notorious among local rescue teams for its exposure to rapidly changing weather conditions and the technical difficulty of several key sections that required basic mountaineering skills. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the emergency physician who would be accompanying them on this mission, arrived just as the first pale light of dawn began to outline the eastern peaks. At 41, Dr. Martinez had been practicing emergency medicine for 15 years, with specialized training in wilderness medical protocols. Her presence on this particular mission had been requested due to reports that one of the injured hikers might require immediate surgical intervention that couldn't wait for transport to the nearest hospital. Her medical bag contained an array of surgical instruments and emergency medications that could mean the difference between a successful rescue and a recovery mission. The missing hikers are David Kowalski, age 32, Elena Rodriguez, 29, and Thomas Mitchell, 35, Dr. Martinez reported as she reviewed the mission briefing on her tablet. They're all experienced hikers with proper equipment according to their emergency contact. David and Elena are married and live in Vancouver. Thomas is Elena's brother, visiting from Toronto. They were planning a 3-day traverse of the Assiniboine region with 2 planned bivouac sites. Aaron nodded as he continued his exterior inspection of the aircraft. The Bell 412 had been specifically configured for search and rescue operations, with medical equipment mounted in the cabin, external rescue hoists, and navigation systems designed for precision flying in challenging terrain. The helicopter's twin-engine design provided the redundancy crucial for mountain operations, where engine failure often meant the difference between a controlled landing and a catastrophic crash. Their emergency beacon was activated from coordinates that put them approximately 2 kilometers southeast of the main trail, in an area known locally as Devil's Canyon, Aaron added, studying the topographical maps spread across the hood of the ground crew vehicle. The terrain there is extremely challenging, with steep granite walls and limited landing opportunities. We'll need to assess the situation from the air before committing to a landing site. The Rescue Coordination Center had provided additional details about the terrain and weather conditions. Devil's Canyon was a narrow gorge carved by millennia of glacial activity, with granite walls rising nearly vertical for over 400 meters on either side. The canyon floor was strewn with massive boulders and ancient rockfall debris, creating a maze of obstacles that made navigation treacherous even for experienced mountaineers. The nearest suitable helicopter landing zone was located on a small plateau approximately 800 meters northwest of the emergency beacon's location, requiring a technical rope rescue to reach the hikers. Rebecca Santos, the ground operations coordinator, approached with the final weather briefing and updated flight plan. At 39, Rebecca had been coordinating search and rescue operations for 12 years, developing an encyclopedic knowledge of the region's terrain and weather patterns. Her role was crucial in maintaining communication between the airborne team and the various ground support agencies that would be standing by during the mission. Wind speeds at altitude are currently 15 to 20 knots from the northwest, with gusts up to 35 knots above 3,000 meters, Rebecca reported. Temperature at the rescue site is estimated to be -2 degrees Celsius, with the possibility of localized snow showers in the higher elevations. Sunrise is at 0642 hours and will have full daylight by 0720. The weight of the mission settled over the team as they completed their final preparations. Each member understood the inherent risks of mountain rescue operations, particularly in the challenging terrain of the coastal mountains. The region's weather could change from benign to deadly within minutes, and the complex terrain often left little margin for error in aircraft positioning and rescue techniques. Captain Michael Stevens arrived as the team was completing their equipment checks. As the regional search and rescue commander, Captain Stevens had overall responsibility for coordinating the various agencies involved in the operation. At 53, he had spent 27 years in emergency services, beginning as a volunteer firefighter before advancing through the ranks of provincial emergency management. His weathered face and graying beard reflected decades of exposure to the elements during countless rescue operations. "We have a ground team standing by at the Assiniboine base camp," Captain Stevens informed the group. Provincial park wardens Jim Blackwood and Lisa Thompson are en route to the area with additional medical supplies and communication equipment. If weather conditions deteriorate, they can reach the rescue site on foot in approximately 4 hours. The backup plan was crucial, as mountain weather in the region was notoriously unpredictable. The same thermal currents and orographic effects that created the area's spectacular scenery also generated sudden wind shears, downdrafts, and rapidly forming cloud layers that could make helicopter operations impossible with little warning. Having ground personnel in position provided an essential safety net for both the rescue team and the stranded hikers. Aaron completed his final systems check and signaled to the ground crew that they were ready for engine start. The familiar whine of the twin turboshaft engines spooling up filled the pre-dawn air, their sound echoing off the hangar walls and surrounding buildings. The aircraft's navigation systems came online, displaying their planned route through the mountain valleys toward the rescue site. The flight would take approximately 45 minutes, following established aviation corridors designed to minimize noise impact on wildlife while providing the safest possible route through the challenging terrain. As the helicopter lifted off from Pemberton Regional Airport, the first rays of sunlight were beginning to illuminate the snow-covered peaks that surrounded them. The beauty of the landscape was breathtaking, with pristine wilderness stretching to the horizon in every direction. Massive glaciers clung to the highest peaks, their blue-white ice fields contrasting sharply with the dark granite faces of the mountains. Dense forests of Douglas fir, western hemlock, and western red cedar covered the lower elevations, creating a green carpet that extended up the mountainsides until the trees gave way to alpine meadows and bare rock. The flight route took them north through the Pemberton Valley, following the course of the Lillooet River as it wound its way between towering mountain ranges. Aaron maintained radio contact with both the Rescue Coordination Center and the ground teams, providing regular updates on their position and estimated arrival time. The aircraft's GPS navigation system displayed their progress along the predetermined flight path, while the terrain mapping system provided detailed information about elevation, obstacles, and potential landing sites. Dr. Martinez used the flight time to review the medical protocols for treating patients with traumatic injuries in wilderness settings. The reported broken leg could potentially involve complications such as arterial damage, compartment syndrome, or fat embolism, any of which could become life-threatening if not properly managed. Her medical kit contained pain medications, antibiotics, surgical instruments, and blood-clotting agents that might be needed to stabilize the patient for transport to definitive medical care. Visual contact with Mount Assiniboine, Aaron announced over the intercom, as the distinctive pyramid-shaped peak came into view ahead of them. The mountain's 3,618-meter summit rose dramatically above the surrounding terrain, its north face catching the early morning light and displaying the complex system of rock bands and ice fields that made it one of the most recognizable peaks in the Canadian Rockies. Sarah was monitoring the emergency radio frequencies, listening for any additional transmissions from the stranded hikers. The emergency beacon continued to transmit its location signal, but there had been no voice communication since the initial distress call received by the Banff National Park Dispatch Center at 0347 hours. The lack of additional communication could indicate that the hikers' radio had been damaged, their batteries had failed, or that their condition had deteriorated to the point where they were unable to transmit. As they approached the general area of the emergency beacon, Aaron began to reduce altitude and airspeed, carefully studying the terrain below for signs of the missing hikers. The Devil's Canyon area was a complex maze of rock formations, steep-walled gorges, and dense forest that made visual identification of small targets extremely difficult. The helicopter's powerful searchlight was equipped with thermal imaging capability, which could potentially detect body heat even in heavily forested areas. "I'm seeing some discoloration on the snow near the coordinates," Marcus observed, pointing toward a small clearing approximately 500 meters below their current position. "Could be equipment or clothing, but I need to get closer to be certain." Aaron maneuvered the helicopter into a hover position that would allow for better observation of the suspected target area. The aircraft's downwash from the rotor system created swirling clouds of snow and debris, making visual confirmation challenging. Through his binoculars, Marcus could make out what appeared to be brightly colored fabric spread across the snow, consistent with the type of emergency shelter or signaling device that experienced hikers would deploy to attract attention from aircraft. "Confirmed sighting of orange and red fabric in a clearing at bearing 275 degrees from our current position," Marcus reported. "I can see movement near the fabric. At least one person appears to be conscious and responding to our presence." The relief in the helicopter was palpable as the team realized they had successfully located the missing hikers. However, their current position was still approximately 300 meters above the canyon floor, with no suitable landing sites in the immediate vicinity. Aaron began searching for alternative landing zones that would allow the rescue team to reach the hikers using rope techniques and ground travel. "I'm seeing a potential landing zone on the plateau northwest of the hikers' position," Aaron announced after completing several reconnaissance passes of the area. "It's approximately 800 meters from the target site, with relatively level terrain and adequate clearance for safe landing operations. However, the approach will be challenging due to wind conditions and terrain features." The landing zone Aaron had identified was a small alpine meadow surrounded by steep granite walls and scattered boulders. The plateau was approximately 100 meters long and 50 meters wide, providing just enough space for the helicopter to land safely if wind conditions remained stable. However, the site's elevation of nearly 3,000 meters meant that the aircraft would be operating near its maximum performance envelope, with reduced power margins for emergency maneuvers. Dr. Martinez was already preparing her medical equipment for rapid deployment, organizing medications and instruments based on the most likely scenarios they might encounter. The reported broken leg could involve complex fractures requiring surgical stabilization, or it might be a simple injury that could be managed with splinting and pain control. Without direct visual assessment of the patient, she had to be prepared for any eventuality. "Beginning approach to the landing zone," Aaron announced as he initiated a careful descent toward the plateau. The helicopter's engines strained against the thin mountain air, their turbine whine increasing in pitch as they worked to maintain adequate power for the demanding approach. Aaron's years of experience in mountain flying were evident in his smooth control inputs and careful attention to the aircraft's performance parameters. The wind conditions at the landing site proved to be more challenging than anticipated, with gusty crosswinds and turbulence created by the surrounding terrain features. Aaron made 2 practice approaches to assess the conditions before committing to a landing, carefully studying the wind patterns and identifying the safest approach path. On the final approach, a sudden downdraft caught the helicopter just as it was settling toward the ground, requiring Aaron to add power and adjust his landing technique to maintain control. "On the ground and secure," Aaron announced as the helicopter's skids settled onto the rocky surface of the plateau. The engines remained at flight idle, ready for immediate takeoff if conditions deteriorated or if an emergency evacuation became necessary. The team immediately began unloading equipment and preparing for the technical rescue operation that would be required to reach the stranded hikers. Marcus took the lead in establishing the rope rescue system, carefully assessing the terrain and identifying the most efficient route down to the canyon floor. The vertical descent would require approximately 200 meters of rope work through challenging terrain that included loose rock, steep ice sections, and potential rockfall hazards. His mountaineering experience and technical rescue training had prepared him for these conditions, but the urgency of the medical situation added pressure to complete the setup quickly without compromising safety. The rescue team's radio crackled with an incoming transmission from the Ground Coordination Center. "Rescue 412, this is base. We have additional weather information that shows a front moving in from the west. Estimated arrival at your location in approximately 3 hours, with potential for significant wind speed increases and reduced visibility." Aaron acknowledged the weather update while mentally calculating the time requirements for the rescue operation. 3 hours would provide adequate time to reach the hikers, assess their condition, and begin the evacuation process, but it left little margin for complications or equipment problems. The approaching weather front could bring wind speeds that would make helicopter operations impossible, potentially stranding the entire rescue team on the mountain. Sarah was organizing medical supplies and coordinating with Dr. Martinez to determine which equipment would be needed immediately at the rescue site. The weight limitations for the rope descent meant that every item had to be carefully selected based on its potential importance for treating the injured hiker. Priority items included pain medications, splinting materials, insulation equipment, and basic surgical instruments. "I have voice contact with the hikers," Dr. Martinez announced, having established radio communication with the stranded group. "David appears to have a compound fracture of the left tibia with significant bleeding. Elena and Thomas are uninjured but suffering from mild hypothermia after spending the night in emergency bivouac conditions. David is conscious but in severe pain and showing early signs of shock." The medical update confirmed the team's worst fears about the severity of the injuries. A compound fracture in the wilderness environment presented multiple serious complications, including the risk of infection, arterial damage, and blood loss that could quickly become life-threatening. The cold temperature and prolonged exposure had undoubtedly complicated the medical situation, potentially affecting blood clotting and increasing the patient's susceptibility to hypothermia. Marcus completed the initial anchor points for the rope system and began the careful process of rappelling down the granite wall toward the canyon floor. His descent route had been chosen to minimize exposure to rockfall and to provide the most direct path to the hiker's location. The rock quality was generally good, consisting of solid granite with adequate features for secure anchor placement, but loose stones and ice patches required constant vigilance during the descent. On the ground and moving toward the hikers, Marcus reported as he reached the canyon floor. His radio transmission was partially broken up by the terrain interference, but the Rescue Coordination Center was able to maintain basic communication. The remaining team members began preparing for their own descent, with Dr. Martinez scheduled to go next, followed by Sarah and finally Aaron, who would remain with the helicopter until the evacuation was complete. The approach to the hikers' location required careful navigation through the boulder field that covered the canyon floor. Many of the rocks were unstable, shifted by frost action and previous rockfall events, making each step a calculated risk. Marcus used his mountaineering skills to identify the safest route while maintaining radio contact with both the hikers and the helicopter crew above. Elena Rodriguez waved frantically as Marcus approached their makeshift shelter, a combination of emergency bivouac gear and natural windbreak created by a large boulder. Her face showed the strain of the long night and concern for her husband's condition, but she appeared alert and coherent despite her exposure to the cold. Thomas Mitchell was tending to David, applying pressure to bleeding wounds and trying to keep him warm with their combined sleeping bags and emergency blankets. "Thank God you're here," Elena called out as Marcus reached their position. "David's been going in and out of consciousness, and the bleeding won't stop completely. We've been trying to keep pressure on the wound, but we don't have proper medical supplies." Marcus immediately began his assessment of David's condition while establishing radio contact with Dr. Martinez to relay medical information. The compound fracture was clearly visible, with bone fragments protruding through the skin of the lower leg. The surrounding tissue was severely swollen and discolored, indicating significant trauma and possible vascular compromise. Blood loss appeared to be substantial, based on the amount of blood-soaked snow and clothing around the patient. "David, my name is Marcus, and I'm with the rescue team," Marcus said, establishing direct communication with the injured hiker. "We have a doctor and paramedic coming down to help you, and we're going to get you out of here. I need you to stay with me and tell me about your pain level." David's response was weak but coherent, indicating that despite his injuries, he remained alert and responsive. His skin was pale and cool to the touch, classic signs of blood loss and shock that required immediate intervention. Marcus began applying more effective pressure bandages to control bleeding while preparing the patient for the arrival of the medical team. Dr. Martinez completed her rappel and immediately took charge of the medical situation. Her training in wilderness medicine was evident as she quickly assessed David's overall condition while simultaneously treating his most immediate life-threatening problems. The combination of trauma, blood loss, and cold exposure created a complex medical emergency that required rapid but careful intervention. "We need to control this bleeding and get him warm before we can even think about moving him," Dr. Martinez declared as she examined the fracture site. The bone fragments appear to have lacerated the anterior tibial artery, which explains the continued bleeding. "I'm going to need to explore the wound and possibly ligate the vessel." The prospect of performing vascular surgery in a wilderness setting, under emergency conditions and with limited equipment, highlighted the extreme nature of their situation. Dr. Martinez's medical kit contained basic surgical instruments, but the sterile environment and sophisticated equipment normally available in a hospital operating room were obviously unavailable. However, without immediate intervention, David's condition would continue to deteriorate, potentially becoming fatal. Sarah arrived at the rescue site carrying additional medical supplies and communication equipment. Her experience as a paramedic in challenging environments made her an invaluable assistant for Dr. Martinez's emergency surgery. Together, they began preparing a sterile field using emergency blankets and antiseptic solutions, while Marcus continued to monitor David's vital signs and maintain communication with the helicopter crew. "Pulse is weak and rapid at 120 beats per minute," Sarah reported as she checked David's wrist. "Blood pressure is dropping and his skin is becoming increasingly pale and cool. We're definitely looking at significant blood loss and early shock." Elena and Thomas watched anxiously as the medical team worked to stabilize David's condition. Both were suffering from mild hypothermia after their night in the mountains, but their injuries were minor compared to David's life-threatening trauma. Marcus provided them with warm drinks and additional insulation while keeping them involved in David's care by having them maintain pressure on bandages and assist with equipment. Dr. Martinez began the delicate process of exploring David's wound to locate and control the bleeding vessel. Working with headlamp illumination and basic surgical instruments, she carefully dissected through damaged tissue to identify the source of hemorrhage. The arterial bleeding was immediately apparent once the wound was opened, with bright red blood pulsing in rhythm with David's heartbeat. "I have visualization of the damaged artery," Dr. Martinez announced. "I'm going to place clamps above and below the injury site and then repair or ligate the vessel, depending on the extent of the damage." The surgical procedure required absolute precision, as any mistake could result in permanent damage to David's leg or loss of the limb entirely. Dr. Martinez's hands worked steadily despite the challenging conditions, her years of emergency medicine experience evident in her calm, methodical approach to the crisis. Sarah assisted by maintaining visibility with additional lighting and managing the surgical instruments. Aaron's voice crackled over the radio with an urgent weather update. "Medical team, be advised that wind speeds at the landing zone are increasing. I'm seeing gusts up to 40 knots with occasional stronger readings. We need to consider accelerating our timeline for evacuation." The deteriorating weather conditions added another layer of urgency to an already critical situation. If wind speeds continued to increase, helicopter operations would become impossible, potentially stranding the entire rescue team on the mountain until conditions improved. However, moving David before his medical condition was stabilized could prove fatal, creating a difficult decision about acceptable risk levels. "Arterial repair complete," Dr. Martinez announced after nearly 30 minutes of careful surgical work. "Bleeding is controlled, and I can feel a pulse in the foot, indicating adequate blood flow below the repair site. We can proceed with fracture stabilization and preparation for transport." The successful repair of David's damaged artery represented a crucial turning point in his treatment, addressing the most immediate threat to his life. However, the compound fracture still required careful stabilization to prevent further tissue damage during transport, and his overall condition remained serious due to blood loss and cold exposure. Sarah began applying a rigid splint to David's fractured leg, while Dr. Martinez started an intravenous line to replace lost fluids and provide pain medication. The combination of medical interventions was beginning to show positive effects, with David's pulse becoming stronger and more regular as his blood pressure stabilized. Marcus had been monitoring weather conditions and maintaining communication with Aaron throughout the medical procedures. The wind speeds at the helicopter landing zone were continuing to increase, with occasional gusts strong enough to make aircraft operations marginal. However, the weather front was still approximately 2 hours away, providing a narrow window for completing the evacuation. "We need to begin moving toward the extraction point," Marcus advised the medical team. I can set up a rope system to raise David to the plateau level, but it's going to take time, and we need to account for the deteriorating weather conditions. The prospect of moving David up the steep canyon walls presented significant challenges, given his condition and the technical difficulty of the terrain. The rope raising system would require careful coordination between multiple team members and precise timing to ensure patient safety. Any mistakes during the raising operation could result in additional injuries or equipment failure that could prove catastrophic. Elena and Thomas were physically and emotionally exhausted, but remained determined to assist with David's evacuation. Both had basic mountaineering experience and could provide valuable help with rope handling and equipment management during the technical rescue. Their familiarity with David's condition and medical history also made them important resources for the medical team. Dr. Martinez administered additional pain medication to David before beginning the move to the extraction point. The combination of fracture stabilization and arterial repair had significantly improved his condition, but the upcoming rope raise would still be extremely painful and potentially dangerous if his injuries were aggravated during transport. "Patient is stable for transport," Dr. Martinez declared after completing her final assessment. "Vital signs are improving, bleeding is controlled, and the fracture is adequately stabilized. However, we need to monitor closely for any changes during the extraction process." Marcus began rigging the rope raising system, using multiple anchor points to distribute the load and provide redundancy in case of equipment failure. The system required approximately 400 meters of rope, arranged in a complex configuration that would allow the team to raise David smoothly up the canyon wall while maintaining control over his position and preventing him from striking rock outcroppings. The technical rescue operation required precise coordination between the team members on the canyon floor and Aaron, who was managing rope operations from the helicopter landing zone above. Radio communication was essential for coordinating the raising sequence, but the canyon walls created significant interference that made clear communication challenging. "Beginning patient raise," Marcus announced as the rope system was activated. David was secured in a specialized rescue litter that would protect him during the ascent while allowing the medical team to maintain access for monitoring his condition. Sarah accompanied David during the raise, continuously checking his vital signs and adjusting his position to prevent complications. The ascent proceeded slowly and carefully, with frequent stops to check David's condition and ensure that the rope system was functioning properly. The canyon walls were steep and irregular, requiring constant adjustments to prevent the litter from striking rock formations. Marcus and the remaining team members followed the litter up the wall, using separate climbing ropes and carrying the medical equipment needed for continued patient care. Elena and Thomas were raised using a separate rope system after the medical team and patient had reached the plateau. Both were exhausted from their ordeal, but relieved that David was receiving professional medical care and that the evacuation was proceeding successfully. Their experience had been traumatic, but the professional competence of the rescue team was helping to restore their confidence that they would all survive the incident. Aaron had been monitoring weather conditions continuously during the rescue operation, noting the steady increase in wind speeds and the approaching cloud formation that marked the advancing weather front. The helicopter was experiencing occasional strong gusts that rocked the aircraft on its landing gear, but conditions remained within acceptable limits for takeoff operations. "All personnel and patient on the plateau," Marcus reported as the final team members reached the helicopter landing zone. "Patient condition remains stable and we're ready for immediate departure." The loading of David into the helicopter required careful coordination to avoid aggravating his injuries, while ensuring that all medical equipment remained properly positioned for continued care during flight. Dr. Martinez and Sarah positioned themselves in the cabin where they could monitor David's condition and provide medical intervention if needed during transport to the hospital. Elena and Thomas were exhausted but able to walk to the aircraft under their own power. Both were suffering from mild hypothermia and dehydration, but their conditions were not immediately life-threatening. They would require medical evaluation and treatment, but their problems were manageable compared to David's serious trauma. All personnel secure and ready for departure, Aaron announced as he completed his final pre-takeoff checks. The helicopter's engines were already running at flight idle, and the aircraft was configured for immediate departure. Weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly, with wind gusts approaching the maximum limits for safe helicopter operations. The takeoff from the plateau required all of Aaron's skill and experience, as gusty wind conditions and the high altitude combined to create challenging flight conditions. The helicopter struggled against the thin air and unpredictable wind patterns, but Aaron's precise control inputs and intimate knowledge of mountain flying techniques enabled a successful departure from the landing zone. Airborne and proceeding to Canmore General Hospital, Aaron reported to the Rescue Coordination Center. Estimated flight time 35 minutes with current weather conditions. Patient is stable and receiving continuous medical care. The flight to the hospital followed a more direct route than their earlier approach to the rescue site, taking advantage of established aviation corridors and favorable terrain features. However, the increasing wind speeds and approaching weather front created turbulence that made the flight uncomfortable for both crew and patients. Dr. Martinez continued to monitor David's condition throughout the flight, adjusting his pain medication and checking the surgical repair site for any signs of renewed bleeding. His vital signs remained stable, and the arterial repair appeared to be holding under the stress of transport. However, he would require immediate surgical intervention once they reached the hospital to properly clean and close the wound and to perform definitive repair of his fractured bone. Sarah was treating Elena and Thomas for hypothermia and dehydration, providing warm intravenous fluids and monitoring their core body temperatures. Both were responding well to treatment and were expected to make full recoveries from their exposure. However, the psychological trauma of the incident would likely require ongoing counseling and support. The helicopter approached Canmore General Hospital as the first snowflakes from the advancing weather front began to fall. The hospital's emergency department had been notified of their arrival and had a trauma team standing by to receive David. The coordination between the rescue team and hospital staff was crucial for ensuring continuity of care and preventing any complications during the transfer. Canmore General, this is Rescue 412 on final approach with trauma patient. Aaron radioed to the hospital's helicopter landing pad. We have a 32-year-old male with compound tibial fracture, arterial repair completed in field, stable vital signs, also transporting 2 additional patients with mild hypothermia. The hospital's trauma team was waiting on the landing pad as the helicopter touched down, with Dr. Sarah Kim, the emergency department chief, leading the medical response. Her team included orthopedic surgeons, vascular specialists, and emergency nurses who had been briefed on David's condition and were prepared to provide immediate, definitive care. The transfer of David from the helicopter to the hospital was accomplished quickly and smoothly, with Dr. Martinez providing a detailed handoff briefing to the receiving medical team. The arterial repair she had performed in the wilderness had undoubtedly saved David's life and limb, but he would still require several hours of surgery to complete the fracture repair and wound closure. Elena and Thomas were also transferred to the emergency department for evaluation and treatment of their hypothermia. Both were conscious and alert, and their conditions were not considered life-threatening. However, they would require several hours of rewarming treatment and medical observation before being cleared for discharge. The successful completion of the rescue operation was a testament to the skill and dedication of the entire team. Each member had performed their duties with professionalism and competence under extremely challenging conditions. The coordination between different agencies and the technical expertise of the rescue personnel had made the difference between life and death for David Kowalski. Aaron completed his post-flight inspection of the helicopter and began preparing his incident report. The mission had been technically challenging due to weather conditions and terrain features, but the aircraft had performed flawlessly throughout the operation. His years of experience in mountain rescue operations had been essential for safely completing the evacuation under deteriorating weather conditions. Marcus began cleaning and organizing the technical rescue equipment used during the operation. The rope systems had functioned perfectly, and all safety protocols had been followed throughout the complex extraction process. His mountaineering skills and technical rescue training had been crucial for establishing the systems needed to reach the hikers and extract them from the canyon. Dr. Martinez and Sarah completed their medical documentation and equipment inventory. The wilderness surgery performed on David had been successful, demonstrating the importance of having advanced medical capabilities available for remote rescue operations. Their combined experience in emergency medicine and wilderness care had been essential for stabilizing David's conditions sufficiently for transport. The rescue operation would later be recognized as an outstanding example of multi-agency coordination and technical competence under challenging conditions. The successful outcome was the result of careful planning, professional training, and the dedication of personnel who routinely risked their own safety to help others in emergency situations. Captain Stevens arrived at the hospital to debrief with the rescue team and coordinate follow-up activities. The successful completion of the mission was particularly satisfying given the technical challenges and weather conditions that had complicated the operation. However, the incident also highlighted the ongoing need for public education about wilderness safety and emergency preparedness. "Excellent work by everyone involved," Captain Stevens commented during the debrief session. "The coordination between agencies was flawless, and the technical execution of the rescue was textbook quality. This operation demonstrates the value of our training programs and equipment investments." The media had learned about the rescue operation and were requesting interviews with the rescue team members. However, the team's focus remained on completing their documentation and preparing for future missions. The recognition was appreciated, but their primary satisfaction came from knowing that they had successfully saved lives and reunited a family. David's surgery at Canmore General Hospital was successful, with orthopedic surgeons repairing his fractured tibia using metal plates and screws. The arterial repair performed by Dr. Martinez in the wilderness remained intact throughout the procedure, and circulation to his lower leg was completely normal. He would require several months of rehabilitation, but a full recovery was expected. Elena and Thomas were treated for hypothermia and released from the hospital the following day. Both had recovered completely from their cold exposure and dehydration. However, they would require ongoing psychological counseling to deal with the trauma of the incident and their fear that David might not survive his injuries. The weather front that had been approaching during the rescue operation brought heavy snow and high winds to the mountains, creating conditions that would have made helicopter operations impossible. The narrow window of opportunity that the rescue team had utilized proved to be crucial for the successful outcome of the mission. Aaron returned to his home in Squamish that evening, tired but satisfied with the day's work. His wife, Jennifer, was a nurse who understood the demands and stresses of emergency medical work. She provided the emotional support that was essential for personnel who regularly dealt with life and death situations. "How did it go today?" Jennifer asked as Aaron settled into his favorite chair with a cup of coffee. "We got them all out," Aaron replied simply. "The injured hiker is going to be fine, and everyone made it home safely." Jennifer understood that Aaron rarely talked in detail about his rescue missions, particularly those involving serious injuries or challenging conditions. His quiet demeanor after difficult missions was his way of processing the stress and emotional demands of his work. She had learned to provide support without pressing for details that he might not be ready to share. Marcus drove back to his apartment in Canmore, reflecting on the technical aspects of the rescue operation. As the youngest member of the team, he felt particularly proud of his contribution to the successful outcome. The complex rope systems and challenging terrain had tested his skills to their limits, but his training and experience had proved adequate for the demands of the mission. His girlfriend, Amy, was a mountain guide who understood the risks and challenges of working in the wilderness. She provided the understanding and support that was essential for someone whose career involved regular exposure to dangerous situations. Her own experience in the mountains made her an ideal partner for someone in Marcus's profession. Dr. Martinez returned to her home in Calgary, where her husband and 2 children were waiting with dinner. As an emergency physician, she was accustomed to dealing with traumatic injuries and life-threatening emergencies. But wilderness medicine presented unique challenges that required different skills and equipment. The successful arterial repair she had performed under primitive conditions was among the most challenging procedures of her career. Her family had learned to appreciate the importance of her work and the satisfaction she derived from helping people in emergency situations. However, they also understood the stress and emotional demands of dealing with trauma patients, particularly in situations where the outcomes were uncertain and the working conditions were challenging. Sarah drove home to her apartment in Pemberton, where her roommate had prepared dinner and was eager to hear about the rescue mission. As a paramedic, Sarah was accustomed to working in challenging environments, but wilderness rescues presented unique challenges that required specialized training and equipment. The successful outcome of the mission was particularly satisfying, given the complexity of the medical and technical problems they had encountered. Her roommate was a teacher who admired Sarah's dedication to emergency medical services, but didn't fully understand the stress and demands of the work. However, she provided the emotional support and normalcy that were essential for someone who regularly dealt with traumatic situations and life-threatening emergencies. The rescue operation would be analyzed and reviewed by the various agencies involved, looking for lessons learned and potential improvements in procedures or equipment. However, the initial assessment was that the mission had been executed flawlessly, with excellent coordination between agencies and outstanding technical performance by all personnel involved. The incident report would document the timeline of events, weather conditions, equipment used, and medical procedures performed. This documentation was essential for maintaining quality control in rescue operations and for providing data that could be used to improve training programs and operational procedures. The success of the rescue operation was also a testament to the value of the extensive training programs that all team members had completed. Regular exercises in challenging terrain and adverse weather conditions had prepared them for the demands of real emergency situations. The investment in training and equipment had clearly paid dividends in terms of operational capability and mission success. David's recovery progressed normally, and he was able to return to work 6 months after the incident. The experience had given him a profound appreciation for the skill and dedication of rescue personnel and had motivated him to become involved in wilderness safety education. He began giving presentations to hiking and mountaineering groups about the importance of proper equipment and emergency preparedness. Elena and Thomas had initially been reluctant to return to the mountains after their traumatic experience. However, with counseling and gradual exposure to less challenging hiking situations, they were eventually able to resume their outdoor activities. The incident had taught them valuable lessons about risk assessment and emergency preparedness that would serve them well in future adventures. The rescue team members continued their careers in emergency services, with each carrying forward the lessons learned from this challenging mission. The successful outcome had reinforced their confidence in their training and equipment, while highlighting the importance of teamwork and interagency coordination in complex rescue operations. Aaron continued flying search and rescue missions for another 8 years before retiring to become a flight instructor for the next generation of rescue pilots. His experience and knowledge were invaluable for training new pilots in the specialized techniques required for mountain rescue operations. Marcus advanced to become a team leader for technical rescue operations, eventually developing training programs for rescue personnel throughout British Columbia. His expertise in rope rescue techniques and mountaineering made him a sought-after instructor for emergency services personnel. Dr. Martinez continued her work in emergency medicine while also developing protocols for wilderness medical care. Her experience with the arterial repair performed under field conditions led to research and training programs that improved the capabilities of rescue teams throughout Canada. Sarah completed additional training in flight medicine and became a specialist in helicopter emergency medical services. Her experience in wilderness rescue operations made her an ideal candidate for the most challenging medical missions in remote areas. The helicopter that had been used for the rescue operation continued in service for several more years before being replaced by a newer model with enhanced capabilities. However, the Bell 412 had proved its reliability and effectiveness under challenging mountain conditions, and similar aircraft continued to be used for rescue operations throughout the region. The Devil's Canyon area, where the hikers had been stranded, was later designated as a special management zone by the Provincial Park Service, with enhanced safety signage and improved emergency communication capabilities. The lessons learned from this incident contributed to better safety measures for future hikers in the region. The successful rescue operation became a case study for training programs throughout North America, demonstrating the importance of multi-agency coordination, technical competence, and advanced medical capabilities in wilderness rescue operations. The techniques and procedures used during the mission were incorporated into training curricula for rescue personnel in challenging mountain environments. Years later, when Aaron looked back on his career in search and rescue, the Devil's Canyon mission stood out as one of the most technically challenging and emotionally satisfying operations he had participated in. The successful outcome had validated the training, equipment, and procedures that had been developed over many years of rescue operations in the unforgiving terrain of the Canadian Rockies. The bonds formed between team members during challenging missions like this one lasted long after their active careers had ended. The shared experience of working together under extreme conditions to save lives created relationships that endured throughout their lives. Regular reunions and continued friendships reminded them of the importance of their work and the satisfaction that came from serving others in their time of greatest need. The families of the rescued hikers maintained contact with the rescue team members, sending annual Christmas cards and updates on their lives. David's complete recovery and return to an active lifestyle was a source of ongoing satisfaction for everyone who had participated in his rescue. The knowledge that their efforts had enabled him to resume his career and family life provided meaning and purpose that extended far beyond the immediate satisfaction of mission completion. The technical equipment used during the rescue operation was regularly maintained and updated to ensure continued reliability and effectiveness. The rope systems, medical equipment, and communication devices were all upgraded periodically to take advantage of technological improvements and lessons learned from operational experience. The training programs for rescue personnel were also continuously updated to reflect new techniques, equipment capabilities, and lessons learned from actual rescue operations. The Devil's Canyon mission provided valuable data about the performance of personnel and equipment under challenging conditions, contributing to improved training methods and operational procedures. The weather monitoring and forecasting capabilities available to rescue teams were enhanced following the mission, providing better information about rapidly changing mountain conditions. The narrow window of opportunity that had enabled the successful rescue highlighted the importance of accurate weather prediction for mission planning and execution. The coordination protocols between different agencies involved in rescue operations were refined based on the lessons learned from this mission. The smooth coordination between the helicopter crew, medical team, ground personnel, and hospital staff had been crucial for the successful outcome, and these procedures became models for future operations. The public recognition of the rescue team's heroic efforts included awards from various professional organizations and government agencies. However, the team members were more interested in the knowledge that their efforts had made a difference in the lives of the people they had rescued. The personal satisfaction of saving lives and reuniting families was far more meaningful than any external recognition. The incident also highlighted the importance of public education about wilderness safety and emergency preparedness. The rescue teams began participating in community outreach programs, teaching hikers and mountaineers about risk assessment, proper equipment, and emergency procedures that could prevent accidents or improve outcomes when emergencies did occur. The continuing evolution of rescue techniques and equipment was influenced by the experiences gained during missions like the Devil's Canyon operation. New developments in rope systems, medical equipment, and communication technology were evaluated based on their potential to improve rescue capabilities in challenging mountain environments. The psychological support systems for rescue personnel were also enhanced following the mission, recognizing the emotional stress and trauma that could result from dealing with life-threatening emergencies. Regular counseling and peer support programs were implemented to help rescue team members cope with the demands of their challenging profession. The legacy of the Devil's Canyon rescue operation extended far beyond the immediate successful outcome, influencing training programs, equipment development, and operational procedures for years to come. The lessons learned from this challenging mission continued to benefit rescue operations throughout the region, improving the capabilities and effectiveness of personnel who risked their own lives to help others in emergency situations. As the years passed, the story of the rescue operation was passed down to new generations of rescue personnel, serving as an inspiration and example of the dedication, skill, and courage required for success in this demanding profession. The technical excellence and teamwork demonstrated during the mission became a standard for others to aspire to in their own careers in emergency services. The continued friendship and professional relationships among the team members who had participated in the rescue served as a reminder of the bonds that were formed during challenging operations. Their shared experience had created lasting connections that enriched their lives and provided ongoing support throughout their careers and retirement. The successful outcome of the Devil's Canyon rescue operation stood as a testament to the value of professional training, quality equipment, and dedicated personnel in emergency services. The lives that were saved and the family that was reunited provided meaning and purpose that justified the risks and challenges inherent in wilderness rescue operations. The story of the rescue would be told and retold for years to come, serving as both an inspiration for future rescue personnel and a reminder of the importance of wilderness safety for outdoor enthusiasts. The successful outcome demonstrated that with proper preparation, training and equipment, even the most challenging rescue situations could be resolved successfully.